Hello, good morning. Buongiorno, bonjour. Ohayo gozaimasu. I'm Alvino Mario Fantini. Most people call me Mario. It's nice to see you all here. Many familiar faces, good friends, mentors, heroes of mine. Thank you all for coming. My father is 86 years old, and we talk almost every day. And he's a delightful character. And the other day, we were talking about what a challenge it was to raise me as a child, and how difficult it was to teach me what to say and more importantly, what not to say in public. So there are many, many anecdotes, many stories. He was reminding me of a few of them. There was once in an airport, I think I saw what I think are called a little person today. People used to say midgets, but for me, and he was smoking a cigar, and I ran around the airport lobby or terminal and said, "Mommy, Daddy, look, a little boy smoking a cigar." And my mom said, "Don't say that. You can't say that to people. You can't say that out loud." There are many examples of my indiscretion. It took many years, as my father reminded me, to teach me what the guardrails of proper conversation are, what to say, what not to say. In school, I had similar experiences. When I was 12, I found a book about the Holocaust, a very serious treatment of that horrible period in our history, and it was called The Yellow Star. And I tried to take it out of the library, but they stopped me. The librarian and my teacher said, no, you're not old enough to read that and comprehend what that's about. You're not ready. I said, fine. As I grew older and became a teenager, I kept encountering other topics and books and ideas that my teachers, my professors told me, no, you're not quite ready to dive into that material. You can't read that. You're not ready. Well, now I'm well past middle age, and I'm still being told what I can and cannot say, and what books I can or cannot read, and what kind of discussions I can have in public or even in private increasingly. So you see the theme here. It's one thing when you're a child and you're learning and you're still kind of a little beast and you have to be guided. It's another thing when, like most of us here, we're rational beings with the capacity to use reason, and we're still being told by the media or our cultural elites or politicians what can or cannot be said. I find it personally annoying, insulting, offensive, upsetting. I could go on and on. I happen to think that most people have a great deal more common sense than we give them credit for. I think people's ability to sniff out right and wrong is vastly underestimated. I happen to think that the more we allow the light of day to shine on things, facts, data, news, opinions, information, concepts, ideas, etc., the more we will be able to develop the ability to discern for ourselves between good and bad, right and wrong, and the more we will be able to hone our ability to sift through things on our own, without guardrails or censors, and sift through things and identify those things that elevate us and those things that debase us. Unfortunately, as I've already said, we have a ruling class, or we have ruling classes, we have cultural mandarins that think otherwise, and they want to tell us what we can or cannot read and dictate what we can or cannot discuss. The European Conservative, of which I'm honored to be the editor-in-chief, was founded in part to fight against this kind of nonsense. Like other innovative publications, some of which are represented in this room, we seek to break open the narrow little cage, as I put it, into which many of us have been thrust. We seek to force a conversation informed by humane learning, right reason, intellectual curiosity, humility, about the ideas, concepts, and values that our media today and our political class tell us are verboten, forbidden, not allowed, anachronistic, dangerous. We at the European Conservative and our friends here in this audience, we seek to remind others that the wisdom of our forefathers, the dictates of common sense, the teachings of our ancestors, the artistic inheritance of the West are not things to be ashamed of. Rather, they're things worthy of respect and vigorous defense. These are things that once ennobled us. They're things that once helped us build a civilization. And I think we can and should remain proud of these things. So as a friend put it, the European Conservative is a very polite, clean, well-manicured finger in the eye of the cultural elites, poking. So a few brief words about our origins, because I think there are people in this audience who've A, never heard of us before, and B, never seen either the print quarterly or perhaps even the website. We started in the bosom of a private association of scholars, writers, academics, who gather every year under the name of the Vandenberg Meeting. The publication began there with a few volunteers. They started a 4-page newsletter. I think it was produced on a laser printer at home, at somebody's home. Never too ambitious. 5 editions came out intermittently over 5 years, and then it stopped. I became the volunteer editor with the 6th edition, and I realized very quickly that there was an opportunity here to create a platform for the intellectual right in Europe. We're now happily in our 25th edition, and we've grown significantly in page count, in the variety of material we publish, in the kind of countries and linguistic traditions we represent, and of course with the opening of our office last week here in Brussels, which I suppose means that we have arrived. Arrived where? I'm not exactly sure. Clearly, though, there is a healthy appetite for what we're producing. I think in the United States they say they're picking up what we're putting out there, some expression like that. Today, in the second panel, we will feature a few of our contributors, people who write for us regularly, and they will discuss why they think this continues to be an important project. In our first panel, however, we will explore this cultural moment in which we find ourselves. For I think many of you will also realize this, we're tapping into something. Something is happening on the center right, on the European right. There's an effervescence, I just told someone outside. There's a bubbling of activity. It's very exciting. At a time like ours, when, as I said in the very beginning, we continue to be told what we can or cannot say, what we can read, what we can publish, what topics or personalities we're allowed to write about and discuss. The European Conservative says, no, you will not tell us that anymore. We'll not allow you, others, to label us in disparaging terms like extremist or reactionaries. We're just intellectually curious, really. We will not allow those who control our culture and media to pigeonhole us into narrow little categories, nor will we allow them to make us feel embarrassed or ashamed for the great inheritance of the Judeo-Christian West. These are all things, the things we defend are values and ideas and artifacts that we've inherited from our forefathers, things we've learned from our fathers and mothers and grandparents. It's very important to defend these things. A few comments very quickly about where our Brussels office fits into this defiant attitude. One of the things that has been missing on the right for years is good old-fashioned reporting. There was a time where I used to say, old-fashioned news is dying and everything's going to be reduced to Bloomberg, market data services, and opinion. There'll be nothing in between. I was wrong. Many of us were wrong. There is clearly a need for good old-fashioned reporting. Good old-fashioned reporting that does not check its values as if they were a hat that you leave at the entrance of an office and then you write your news story. Good old-fashioned reporting that allows an opinion or a perspective or a certain set of values to come through, to shine through. So we, the European Conservative, has come to Brussels to start reporting on European affairs, on EU activities, obviously, with a decidedly conservative perspective. We've come to Brussels to turn up the heat on the European institutions and on the entire political class. And we've come to Brussels to offer a safe space for intellectual dissidents, for conservatives who somehow feel ignored or left behind, and to create a community which may even evolve into a family. Simply put, we've come to Brussels because there was a need, we saw a gap that needed to be filled, and also because we felt it was our duty as the magazine and website grew, well, we had to come to Brussels. I hope in time you will all agree that there was wisdom in this decision. I also hope that over the coming weeks and months, you will all become our friends, allies, collaborators. There are many projects we have in mind, and I hope that you can all become participants or guests, even speakers at one of our many planned events. So I extend to all of you a sincere welcome to become part of this little community, this little platoon that we're trying to form. A community of inquisitive minds, of the intellectually curious, of the daring, of the republic of letters that we're seeking to create. We are conservative, yes, that's true. We have no truck with the intolerance of today's mainstream media and cultural elites. So if you are also fed up with this kind of narrowness and intellectual self-annihilation, then please join us. With that, I'd like to introduce our managing editor, the best editor I know, mind you, the legal strategist and wordsmith without whom much of this could not have happened, my best friend and partner, and my very own path to heaven, Ellen Krieger Fantini.
It's so good to see all of your faces. I feel like we've already begun to create a community in our first week here. So I'm going to remove myself from the podium and take one of these seats and invite our first panel to join us up here. So maybe I'll introduce you as you come up, starting with Vito De Chevilly. He's the director of New Direction, the official political foundation of the ECR family, the conservative group in the European Parliament. He previously worked for the European Parliament and for the Polish Electricity Association. Have a seat. Thank you. Mark Granza is the founding editor and publisher of IM 1776, one of the fastest growing publications on the online dissident right. Anne-Elisabeth Moutet is a French journalist, writer, and columnist. She writes for the Daily Telegraph in London, particularly on international affairs, and she also writes for Unheard. And Mick Hume is a journalist and author. He was the launch editor for Spiked Online and regularly writes on free speech issues. So welcome, please welcome all of our panelists, and we'll get right into our discussion. So this panel, entitled The Need for Dissident Publishing, I think Mario did a very good job in setting up the questions that I hope to pose to this group. And what I'm hoping we can do is a bit of a fusion of the normal panel discussions in which I pose a question and each of them goes along the line, giving their opinion about something. I hope to have a conversation, so I encourage you all to be ready to grab the microphone and say, yes, I agree, or no, I don't. And let's try to have a conversation. I'll prompt you with some of these things. So the first point I'd like to start with is where Mario left us with this question of what is this cultural moment? When you hear the phrase, this cultural moment, we all nod. I think we all know what this means, but I'd like to ask our panelists to try to articulate that if they can. What does this cultural moment mean to you as it relates to the need for dissident publishing or a safe space for people holding the views that many of us hold? So feel free to jump in so I don't call on people, but maybe Anne-Elizabeth, you look ready to answer.
Yes, I tend not to use the expression "this cultural moment," mostly because it's something that has been gradually happening, and it's a tightening of what is allowed or not allowed, and the policing of it. So what started off as quarrels between intellectuals and between usually journalists, because we're very quarrelsome, and it's the only way we can make a mark. You know, it's nowadays, what we write one day is wrapping pixels of, virtual halibut, but still, it is very ephemeral, and therefore, the fights among journalists about sort of questions that are made to sound incredibly important and aren't. I always direct people back to Balzac's great novel about journalists, Lost Illusions, Les Illusions Perdues, and honestly, it is a wonderful book. I strongly recommend it. But we now have come at a point of censorship in which willingly, instead of being forced, like the Chinese and the Soviets, we have a self-appointed young elite who have been cosseted in such a way that they cannot bear the idea of something dissenting because it makes them literally physically ill. And that's the result of 20, 30 years of affluent helicopter parenting, with the result that we have these people who are going to be, for some appreciable time, our bosses, our editors, and in a sense sort of shape a conversation which they do not like. And their first attitude is an attitude of policing. It's an attitude of creating shibboleth. I was reading recently a piece about two pieces about sensitivity readers, and some of you sheltered people do not know what a sensitivity reader is. So for the others, please excuse me. It is now seen that, literature and books in general are not supposed to sort of shake you up and show you things you don't know. They are supposed to reinforce the prejudices that have been so carefully calculated in the current education system. So publishing houses, this started, and it's very telling that it started with young adult literature. So what shapes basically young people? It is very interesting that one of the great writers of the day who got lots of kids reading, J.K. Rowling, is now somebody who probably wouldn't be able to publish most of what she wrote, even though it happens in Fantasyland, Harry Potter. So young people, with the help of the holy internet, are told what not to accept. And so writers nowadays have to show their manuscript to a reader. It started with young people, but now it's all publishers. And so that there are things that are not, you can't write these things. And one wonderful example was last week, Anthony Horowitz, who writes now this sort of new generation of James Bond books, but who's written adventure stories and created heroes made into movies like the Alex Rider series. And I mean, he's a great writer. He writes yarns more than sort of great literature, but he is a massively enjoyable writer. He cannot write a boring page. He has a book in which one of the characters is a Native American. He was told by his sensitivity reader that this man cannot attack somebody else with a scalpel, because a scalpel sounds like scalping. Scalping people is what Indians in Westerns did, and of course that is racist, and therefore he had to change the weapon. And he was outraged. He said scalpel is something from the Latin, and it's always been a knife. It's never been anything to do with, oh, it doesn't matter because the readers might confuse it. So there's this kind of predictiveness, which is really like Minority Report. You know, a crime is about to be committed, and we want to prevent the crime from being committed. And this is the kind of cosseting and narrowing of horizons that happen. Anthony Horowitz said, "I'm not, you know, I didn't fight it. It was not a major thing in the book, but that an adult writer who's sort of created a readership is forced by his publishers, who are essentially afraid of any kind of fight that would make them lose money, because that's the whole point, will meekly accept this. And this happens at every level. There are books that have been killed off before they were actually published because review copies were sent to the kind of young people who grew up on internet feuds and who now sort of translate this to places like Goodreads. We've got in all areas, but I wanted to sort of I wanted to point this one out. But you know, we will probably this morning talk of many instances of this. But essentially, what we're witnessing what prophetic sort of prophetically Christopher Lasch, I think it was Christopher Lasch, called the narrowing of the American mind. Alan Bloom. It was one of them, and I got the wrong one. But the narrowing of the sort of the Western mind is, of course, something that is taken by our enemies in China, in Russia, somewhere else, as, oh, this is wonderful. I mean, this is great. I mean, they're doing half the job. Have they been helped? I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but essentially, we are diminishing ourselves, and it's something we have to fight against. I'm sorry I went speechy about this.
No, I think we all welcome these very concrete examples. Be told.
If I may add, because you focus on the content, but I think that the problem in Brussels is even worse, is that people are not focusing on the content, but on who is speaking.
As well.
Who are you? And that's the biggest problem that we have here in Brussels. I will never forget that a few years ago, ECR Party organized a big event with Morawiecki, the Polish Prime Minister. Non-single journalist came to the event. It was a chance for them to ask questions, you know. It was a thing 4 years ago, maybe on abortion, everything, foreign policy, NATO. Nobody came. And because he's a conservative leader. And I think that what you mentioned is about the content, but we also need to fight this issue that the opposition is putting us to a corner because we are speaking from a conservative side.
Good morning. I'm rather surprised to see so many people here because reading the British press, I was quite convinced there are no conservatives in Brussels. It's since my old friend and comrade Nigel Farage took his troops home, apparently there are no longer anybody to worry about over here because we just don't hear those voices. I think it is a cultural moment in the sense that we've finally got a word to describe it. It's been coming for a long time, this intolerance in the name of tolerance. And we now have a phrase, cancel culture, which at least gets close to describing the moment that we live in. I started off as a writer on the left because I believed that free speech and democracy, the two things that I care most about, were historically left-wing issues. This is 40 years ago. And I discovered even then, very quickly, that my friends and I were the only people who thought of ourselves as left-wing who believed in free speech. And so we spent most of our time arguing against the left and their attempts to no platform anybody they disagreed with. And I now find myself politically homeless in a situation where those people who I was arguing with at university, who called themselves left-wing, now run the world, or basically control the culture that we're living in. I wrote a book a few years ago called Trigger Warning about the struggle for free speech, and I described the change in the kind of what they called themselves liberal, but the illiberal liberals, the change in the cultural outlook, which was the change from the classical outlook associated with Voltaire in Europe, which we know he never said it, his British biographer kind of coined the phrase for him, but associated with Voltaire, that I may hate what you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it. We now have what I described in my book as the reverse Voltaires, whose outlook is, I know I will hate what you're going to say, and I will fight to the death of free speech for my right to stop you saying it. Right? You cannot say it. You can't say that. They can't say that culture. And so this is what we are up against. We're up against forms of censorship, both state censorship, often in the form of hate speech laws that say anything that is considered offensive can be outlawed. Informal censorship, the kind of Twitter mob mentality of shouting down anybody that speaks out of turn, and self-censorship. The fear of saying the wrong thing, which means that many people who hold the kind of views that are held in this room just don't say anything, just don't speak. So we need a space everywhere, and particularly somewhere like Brussels, where you are free to say and think what you like, where we can get back to a kind of classical Voltairean idea that no idea is too dangerous to be expressed. Everything can be debated. How on earth are we going to establish what we believe to be true if we don't have everything on the table? So that's why I really welcome initiatives. That's why I helped to launch Spiked Online 20 years ago. That's why I really welcome something like the European Conservative here in Brussels. So opening up a space, piercing the bubble. I mean, some of us would like to shatter the bubble in Brussels, but at least if we can pierce it and have a little bit of light in there, it'll be a great step forward.
Yeah, I roughly agree with pretty much everything that's been said on the panel. I'd like to add, I guess, a couple of things, just to address your initial question about the culture moment we're living in. Obviously, let's say I'm a little bit on the fringes of the acceptable discourse, perhaps even more than the panelists over here. So I'll take a slightly different approach, I think. I think everyone in this room pretty much agrees already on what the left is doing wrong, and the left represents a little bit of a problem. But I think actually the opposition to the left also, in a bit, represents a little bit of a problem in the sense that it's not well organized. It's broadly visionless in the sense that the alternatives to the current mainstream liberal consensus tend to be either suppressed or not addressed properly, not articulated properly. I'll make one of the many examples I can make. You know, we're talking censorship now. When I was at a recent conference as well in Budapest, pretty much addressing the things that we're addressing now, and the terms gatekeepers often come up, you know, and we tend to think of the gatekeepers as the left, which I actually think is a mistake and a misunderstanding what the term is, because the left is really not concerned, doesn't really have time to gatekeep. It's basically, you know, like a speeding train, you know, smashing everything that's on its way. It's not concerned really about gates. I think the actual gatekeepers are the people that proclaim to be in opposition to it, but, you know, they try to restrain various forms of practical solutions or ideological forms of ideas that could find its way into the public discourse. And these people tend to be, you know, disaffected liberals, or like classical liberals or whatnot. And I think that that's one of the problems with coming up with actual alternatives and something that can actually counter the pernicious forces of the left, is that the people that are sort of like functioning as the opposition to it, they're very scared of, you know, actually fighting back. And I'll make another example, another problem. I think it's, you know, I'm just addressing just the visionless problem of the conservative movement doesn't really have like a well articulated and really alternative to counter the left. But another example is like, you know, again, we're talking censorship, and, you know, for the past 6 years, we've been like screaming censorship and, you know, essentially, you know, making the argument that, you know, big tech and all these forms of like, you know, corporate powers and state affiliated corporate powers, they're silencing us. You know, for the past 6 years, we've been like craving for proof of that, and then the proof has come out in the forms like the Twitter files that's been released, that has been, you know, essentially providing the proof of what have been said for the past 6 years. The word has just moved on because I guess, you know, there's a Chinese balloon flying over Arizona, whatever, and so let's just move on, you know. And this is kind of like the problem with the opposition to the left. It's not as organized, it's not as ready, it's broadly focusing its critique on like abstract terms. It's, you know, it's liberalism, cancel culture, but, you know, liberalism is held by liberals, which are actually people, which are organizations and networks, foundations, and, you know, the state, the Democratic Party in the US or whatever. And these people, they, you know, they need to be held accountable, and then there's need to be like an actual strategy to, you know, prosecute hold hearings and whatever solution that can actually make a dent and change the current status quo. So yeah, I'm kind of like sketching like various problems in, you know, but yeah, that's what I think the problem is. Actually the opposition, I mean, everyone agrees in this room that the left represents the problem. I think that we should focus more on what the best opposition to it actually might be.
Well, this I think all of these remarks bring me to another point, which is that I think certainly in recent memory, the right, both sort of the political right, but also in media and intellectual life, much of the time and energy has been spent responding to arguments, responding to attacks. And so there's been this sort of defensive response rather than either sort of an offensive response, and that doesn't mean offensive, although I think probably people can take it that way, but the idea that people, let's say broadly on the right, and by broadly on the right, I do mean also the people that Mick mentioned and that Mark mentioned, this sort of dissident, even left, or politically homeless or ideologically homeless cohort who maybe sort of started their lives assuming that they would find themselves comfortably on the left, and then started looking around and realizing that if they really wanted to tell the truth or their opinions about something, the only place left to do that is in these right-wing or center-right or dissident right publications. So I want to talk about political, let's say, defense versus offense, but then also talk about the discourse generally, and how do we turn it around so that we're not constantly sort of using a shield. I'm not necessarily saying or not saying that we should be using a sword rather than a shield, but I think we need to start turning things around so we're not responding to someone else's narrative. So maybe I'll start with Vitold on the sort of political side of things.
Thank you. I think indeed that we should be very careful because we receive a lot of attacks from the left and we should defend ourselves. But I think that we should do something even more. We should also have newspapers, mainstream media from our family who will be critical towards our leaders and our policies. I think that if we do that, then maybe we will get more people on board with us. The problem is that we are only answering to some attacks all the time, and sometimes we are a bit less maybe objective because we receive so many attacks that, you know, at the end of the day, you are just like, wow, I cannot be neutral because the opposition is not neutral, objective. So I have to do something. And I think that we need more media like European Conservative who actually is promoting and defending ideology and not a leader or one policy, and be critical about what is happening, what will be implemented, if the leader that we elected will do a good job or not. And we need more people, more newspaper like that. I think that the left is quite good in that, that if they have a leftist leader who is not good, they will criticize him without any problems. We don't do that. And I think that it should be something that we should change quite quickly.
I think Vitold is really onto something here because we have people who are not politically homeless. I too started on the left. I voted for François Mitterrand twice. You know, I forgive. You know, please forgive me for I have sinned. But no, what we still have are generous ideas about the human condition, and this is what drives us. But what I believe in, there is such a thing as offensive because every now and then you've got to answer the punches, but I believe in jiu-jitsu. I believe in using the momentum of the enemy so that, you know, it's entirely their momentum that sort of makes them lose balance. And the idea is, first of all, the obvious sort of unforced errors when they sort of, you know, it's so obviously ridiculous that we can have a bit of fun with that. And something which I know Mario agrees with is we must have fun doing this. You know, the counter-revolution must be more fun than the revolution. It's not going to be more difficult, I mean, to be more fun than these people. But the other thing is that I think that if we have possible, you know, ad hoc alliances of just inviting somebody with whom we disagree but who seems to be very sensible, we should jump at it. And I'm going to give an example, and some people in this room are not going to agree on the question that it was all about is Ukraine, and I know not everybody agrees on Ukraine here, but it doesn't matter. Olivier Besancenot is a Trotskyite leader in France. He's a postman. He's been the leader of one of the Trotskyite parties in France. But he's a man who was, went on a parliamentary mission to Ukraine, and he came back and he said, this is an existential war of liberation by, people who've been attacked. And he says, what I feel are all the right things, sorry. But anyway, he says this, and I was thinking, this is the man we should go and interview now. If a Trotskyite every now and then wakes up and says, this is what's happening, say, look, just say what you said to the other paper, we'd be delighted to give you a berth. And that is, first of all, is going to confuse people whose mind is so formatted that this is the opposite of cancelling. So whenever we find someone and we say, look, we disagree on other things, you agree on this, come debate, right? And that's really what we should do. It also will make for something that more people will have to pay attention to.
I am all for having fun. I think there's far too little humour in journalism. However, I think we do also have to recognise the absolute seriousness of the situation that we're in. We are facing a situation, which is not, jokes are an important way of countering it. We are facing a situation where the leaders of major political parties appear unable to tell us what a woman is. Where leading intellectuals and politicians will stand up in public and say that men can be pregnant and a woman can have a penis. This is what Orwell described as the Big Brother's ultimate victory, making us deny the evidence of our own eyes and ears. But that's the culture that we're dealing with now. In that situation, what we have to do is go on the offensive. I'm entirely in favour of taking every opportunity, because as by the way, the trans debate has recently demonstrated, when you do pick holes and use their momentum against them, they collapse very quickly, right? The holes in the logic of their argument are there to be exposed. So we have to go on the offensive. I've always believed that. I believe absolutely in the right to be offensive. Salman Rushdie, whose pictures we saw this week of the injuries that he suffered in America last year, after that attack, until those photographs this week, he'd basically been, what happened to him had been removed from the news altogether. We don't want to talk about it because it's Islamophobic to somehow talk about what happened to Salman Rushdie. And actually, many people on the left, although they don't agree with stabbing Salman Rushdie, they do agree that you shouldn't have the right to offend different groups of people. And so they kind of have paved the way for that kind of violence. So when Salman Rushdie first had the fatwa issued against him, at the end of the 80s, I was just in my 20s, and I just launched a magazine called Living Marxism that I was the editor of. And I wrote an editorial in 1989 called Defend the Right to be Offensive. I think it was possibly the first time that had been written and published in the English language, certainly the first time in a Marxist magazine. I absolutely believe in that. Defend the right to be offensive. We must have the right to offend established opinion, and we must have the right to go on the offensive against them, because the seriousness of the situation demands it. We just have not got the time to be defensive or careful about things. Of course, we must always, don't be hysterical, don't be shrill. The tone is important, but the content has to be undiluted, and we mustn't take no prisoners.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily a free speech absolutist in any way whatsoever. I actually tend to think of free speech more as a tool. I broadly agree with Victor earlier that basically said that if you push his idea to the extreme, is essentially saying, we actually, the real problem with the left is not how it's doing the thing, is what is it doing. How is it doing is actually kind of makes sense. You do whatever you can to push your own agenda forward. There's an infamous incident, perhaps not infamous enough, about like this member of this kind of intellectual group that's come to be known as like the intellectual dark web. I think it was Brett Weinstein, his Evolution of Psychology. It wasn't this like Twitter space or like Clubhouse thing, essentially arguing against the PC woke types about like their methods, it essentially was objecting to procedural ground rather than actual ideological ideas. It wasn't like he actually at a certain point of the conversation he said, but I'm an actual liberal, I'm on your side, and despite that, they cast him out. And that's exactly what they should do, because like if you're on their side, then why would you object on how exactly you get your side to implement your own ideas, your own agendas, and create the sort of like vision, implement the kind of vision that you have. And this is what I refer to when I broadly speak about the gatekeeping problem, is people that are generally offended and oppose the left more on like a politeness and procedural ground. I don't like how fast you're going. I don't like how how you're silencing the opposition, but they don't really object on an ideological level. They actually want like a more progressive society. They just don't want a progressive society to implement their progressive vision the way that they're doing it now. And so I think like the opposition should actually be more focused about like straightening out exactly what the alternative is. What the counter train, to bring out a metaphor before the train speeding pedals to the floor of the left, and they should understand that the only thing that's going to stop the left is another speeding train going in the opposite direction rather than putting gates in the middle. And yeah, I wanted to say something else, but I forgot.
I agree with you that we should invite, people with whom we disagree, and that we should make sure that we promote free speech. But if I may say, first we have to clean our house. You know how many times I tried to invite someone, and someone from my family said, "Don't invite him. I don't like him," or he didn't vote on my bill. Last event that we had in Tallinn. Thank you for coming, Elizabeth, Mario, and all our friends. After one panel, a speaker came to me and asked me, "Why did you invite this guy?" And my answer was very easy. The speaker just asked me the same about you. And it's not a joke. It's a fact. And I think that you mentioned gatekeeper. We have gatekeepers at each level, and also within our political family. We are a political foundation, so we have many different gatekeepers, and they are, putting some limits to our actions. And if we don't clean our house first, we'll never be able to do this job at a higher scale.
Yeah, and can I just add one more thing, because I recall what I wanted to add is basically the other problem is that is very just focused on criticizing. It's basically complaining at the end of the day of what is going on the cultural level. I think that the main cultural problem is that there is no plan to implement a conservative right-wing dissident culture. There is, when's the last time you heard of like a foundation, focusing and funding, content creators, artists, or like art exhibitions, or like movie projects and whatnot? Their energy are just focused like on a policy level, or basically just criticizing what the left is doing without actually having a plan to create an alternative.
Right. Well, without saying that the European conservative intends to do all of these things, I will say that part of the reason we're here in Brussels, and we do like to talk about disruption, and so that's a good example. So one of the reasons that we're here in Brussels, and this wasn't sort of a randomly chosen city of Europe. The reason we're here in Brussels is because we think that the European conservative, this thing that we've become, the magazine, the website, the news reporting, but also what we think is a community we're building, can be a place, a physical place, as well as an intellectual place where people can gather. And what we hope is that here in Brussels, we can bring people in the same room to discuss cultural things, maybe set the political aside occasionally, and have people in the same room who don't care how the other one voted on something, but they want to talk about a sculpture exhibition, for example. We think that if we're going to save Western civilization, it can't be by policy alone, certainly. And so we hope that everyone in this room and everyone who likes what we're doing sees that it's something larger than than policy positions or parties or political groupings, but rather we have something very important to save, and we recognize what it is. So that's my push for what someone said last night is the movement. A movement, it's beyond networking, it's beyond a media platform. We've taken to using the phrase "join us." Sounds a little, I don't know, maybe a little creepy, but join us, subscribe to our magazine. But what we really mean is that many people find themselves, as we've said, politically or ideologically homeless, and we really need for them to be able to talk to one another. There's so much isolation. People sort of have to use code words to see if the other person is safe enough to actually talk to and say what you really think. I mean, everyone in this room probably has had that experience. I'm looking at one such person who I met years ago, and she and I were on a bus in The Hague at an advanced law seminar, and I said the word Christian. And I wasn't referring to my brother, whose name is Christian. And she and I sort of looked at each other and did a little, secret wink, because it meant that we could actually find something in common. So anyway, I'm not the panelist, I should be quiet. But the point is, let us think about something larger than political groups and really think in terms of a movement. I do want to move just a little bit to one of the functions the European Conservative is filling here in Brussels, and that is news. So our website has a very active news reporting function. And so why do we need yet another news outlet? Well, everyone talks about unbiased news, and we need neutrality. But I think all of us as adults in this room understand that there's no such thing as unbiased news, right? So an editorial decision about what headline is run, or even what we consider to be news, important enough to use the resources of a reporter to write about it, that's not a neutral decision, right? Of course it's biased. So we just don't hide it. We're called the European Conservative. I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward. But having that bias doesn't mean that we're not going to tell the truth. And it's important to have that point of view. So I want to ask this group, how can the news from Brussels and around the world be told in a truthful, accurate, and conservative way? In other words, where are the gaps that are obvious that need to be filled from your perspective? And I'll start with Mick.
Thank you. Well, we were talking about censorship and cancel culture, but a much broader issue than that, which hits what you're talking about, Alan, is the culture of conformism. That there are certain things you don't need to be censored; you just don't talk about it. I mentioned Orwell before. In his fantastic essay on the freedom of the press, that was written as a preface to Animal Farm, but the publisher refused to publish it, which is quite an ironic reflection on his thing. Orwell made the point there that during the Second World War, obviously we see it currently in Ukraine, when there's a war, there's censorship. Truth is the first casualty and so on. Everybody knows that. Orwell made the point that even during the Second World War, the great war of the 20th century, there was very little censorship in Britain. There was some. The communist newspaper the Daily Worker was banned. The Daily Mirror was threatened with being banned. But on the whole, as he made the point, there was very little censorship because it wasn't necessary. Because the people who ran the newspapers and the publishing industry and everything in culture understood that there were certain things that it would not do to mention. There were certain facts and truths that should not be mentioned. He compares it to the kind of Victorian etiquette where you couldn't mention trousers in front of a lady. It's that kind of thing. There were certain things which should not be said, and you didn't need a law to tell you to do it. He was particularly talking about, in the British press, you could not criticize Stalin's Soviet Union during the Second World War because they were allies in the war, and all the terrible things that Stalin was doing at home could not be mentioned. You didn't need a law to tell the newspapers not to do it. It just was not done to mention those truths. Now, that kind of conformism, I think, we're not in a war of that sort, but we're in a culture war. And that kind of conformism, I think we are dealing with today. There are certain things which are just not to be talked about. Or if they are talked about, we get them off the agenda as quickly as possible. Brussels is in the middle of the biggest corruption scandal that any of us have ever heard, right? What happened to that story? It made headlines for 2 days in most of the English language press, and then it just disappeared. Oh, well, the investigation's ongoing, et cetera, et cetera. We all know what happened. The wrong people are being investigated. The wrong people have been caught out, so we don't want to talk about it. And in fact, if there's been commentary about it, the commentary has mostly been to say, oh, this is very dangerous because it will let the right go around saying that the EU is corrupt. Not that the problem isn't that the EU is corrupt, the problem is the optics. It looks bad, so let's not talk about it. So that kind of conformism, which is removing actual facts and truths from the news, has got to be challenged. And I think that's the kind of role that the European Conservatives can play in its news reporting. It's just telling the untold story. That's a very good starting place for changing the culture here.
I'm sorry, I have to disagree a bit with you on that issue, because even though I'm very keen to say that when someone from the left will do something bad, we will try to not cover it. But on the Qatargate, I think that this issue has been very well covered in Brussels, and everyone is talking about that every day, at least in Brussels, maybe not in UK. But my problem is not that we are not covering that. The problem is that we are not using that, right? I would put the stress on that issue, first thing. And second thing, the second issue is that it's a bit technical, but the former vice president of the parliament has been replaced by someone of her family. So it means that we, the right, we didn't use this momentum to increase our power within the parliament.
Were there constitutional sort of parliamentary sort of ways of doing that that would not have meant a coup or something?
You are referring to the Don system.
To increase
yes, because normally there's a Don system within the parliament, but it's only respected when it's in the favor of the big power. But you can always go against that. The ECR group, for instance, and the ID, they already lost a few seats because the majority decided to go against the internal rules of the parliament. So the Don system.
That must be covered.
So I'm going to follow up with Vitold as, and I don't mean this as an insult, you're sort of our Brussels insider at the moment on the stage. At least you've worked here longer than the rest of us.
Where you can find good food, yes.
So let me ask about the role of news reporting here in the bubble. Obviously, our journalist team intends to cover what happens here as well as around Europe. What gaps, I mean, I think we can very well identify the gaps that we see. From your perspective, what are the gaps in the media landscape here in Brussels, from your perspective?
I think the gap is huge. Thanks to Robert, I can say that only 20% of the correspondents in Brussels are covering EU affairs. First thing. The main public Polish channel TV has only one person in Brussels covering EU affairs, NATO, Belgium, Luxembourg. It's impossible to deal with everything. Then if you move to a EU newspaper website channel, Politico, Euractiv, EU Observers, yes?
European?
Excuse me?
The New European?
Yes. We have to check the business model. That's something that we didn't mention yet. What's the business model of this newspaper? It's actually sponsorship events. You know how much it costs to do an event with Politico? Any idea? At least 80,000 to do an event with Politico, at least. And that's just, without water, yes? So if you think about that, you understand that the main revenue is not coming from selling the journal, because actually Politico is selling very few journals, or the subscription to the newsletter focusing on energy and so on, is on this kind of activities. So, sorry, to answer to your question, yes, we need to have a better competition. There's no competition actually in Brussels regarding EU affairs and EU news. There's no competition at all. That's the main problem. And I'm very happy that you will join this monopoly and that you will try to change a bit the rule of the game.
Great, great. Well, I think there's a clear gap. Speaking more broadly about identifying gaps and filling them, I want to ask Mark, your journal, IM 1776, has taken off and is very much in the same vein as the European conservatives print magazine. It's quirky, it's interesting, it asks questions and talks to people who otherwise are maybe ignored. What gaps do you see in the larger media landscape, and what still remains even with the entry of some dissident journals?
Thank you, first of all. And I'd like to, before I answer your question, take a little bit of a step back to what you said earlier, that there's no such thing as like neutral news, which I think is correct. Even if you try to be as neutral as you can, the news is in the, the opinion is in the news that you pick. And this is what I think there's the big overlap between, in terms of like strategy, between what we're doing and what you guys are doing, the European Conservative, is actually providing a consistent and coherent direction forward, and not just capitalizing on any form of dissent that just happens to be, broadly aligned with your vision or opinion. For example, I would never go out of my way to publish someone I disagree with, which I think is a very, very silly thing to do. And a lot of people, like, they take virtue, they virtue signal. They think that's a great thing because that makes them look humble. But it's actually, I think that's more on the, I'm hesitant to say, but my opinion is it tends to be a little bit of a form of laziness, because, like, pardon my French, but you can completely screw up editorially, and then you can just say, oh, actually, I knew it was a terrible article, but I think even like low IQ people should have a voice. Which I really think is the main reason why a lot of publications make free speech their main, freedom of expression their main issue. And what we're trying to do actually was trying to identify what are the actual more practical and intellectually honest and coherent form of dissent, and trying to synthesize a way forward for the opposition. And when I started the magazine, a lot of these people were congregated like in online corners like Twitter, and a lot of these people were, broadly speaking, reactionaries, somewhat reactionary monarchists or Nietzschean right-wing types. Some of them are still, a lot of them are Christians. I'm aware of the contradiction. And what we're trying to do is picking up from that energy that is sort of like building up, and that there tends to be very insightful, and trying to abstract from that some kind of like coherent vision forward, and basically.
I entirely agree with it's not the job of publications to give their enemies a platform. As an absolute defender of free speech and freedom of the press, I also believe in editorial judgment and the right of editors to publish what they see fit to do. And so when people say to me, why won't Spike publish me? You say you believe in free speech. So yeah, you've got the right to speak, but you haven't got the right to be heard. You haven't got the right to be on my platform talking about it. So I completely agree with that distinction. I just want to say something about objective journalism. There's a character in Britain, he's actually in America now, that you may have heard of, called Prince Harry. And he wrote this book that's got a little bit of coverage. And in this book, he describes journalists as the scum of the earth, basically, because they print stories that he doesn't like. They invade his privacy, whereas he demands the right to invade his own privacy as an exclusive right. But although he's very disparaging about journalists, Harry seems to become the role model for too many people in journalism, because what he says in his book is, what I think happened and what I feel happened is just as much a truth as your so-called objective facts, right? There are many people in journalism who seem to operate on the same principle today, that what matters is the way you feel about things rather than the facts you should be reporting. And a senior editor from the ex-editor from the Washington Post, who was actually involved in the great stories back in the day, has just come out and said that we've got to get rid of objectivity in journalism. We've got to have truth-telling journalism. In other words, we've got to say the things we want to say, that we feel, rather than objectivity and facts. And I think that is so dangerous. It's so destructive of news. So I entirely agree with you, Ellen. There's no such thing as neutral news. Every publication has its own angle, and the European Conservative has to have a very clear agenda that it's pushing, and you choose your news stories accordingly. But we've got to hold the line on at least an attempt at objectivity, difficult though we know it is, yeah, so that we're at least trying to tell the truth, using the facts to support our arguments. I had a debate a few years ago about war journalism with a leading British journalist in front of a load of journalism students at the London School of Economics. And she was arguing that not only was objectivity impossible, but it was not worth pursuing. You know, you had to be on the right side of history and all of that. They put it to a vote, and overwhelmingly the students agreed with her and disagreed with me. And I said, if you believe that, then I suggest what you all do tomorrow is go and resign from your journalism course and sign up to study poetry or playwriting or something creative, because that's what you're talking about. So I'm all in favor of propagating an idea, putting out a point of view, arguing, and this is what's got to be done to burst the bubble. But we've got to hold the line on objectivity and truth in journalism, or we're all going to turn into Prince Harry.
If I can I just add one thing? If I can just add one thing, I think when people actually try to be neutral, essentially what they do is basically turn their project into a commodity versus service, which is, you know, I believe like European conservative publication like ours, they're trying to, you know, as I said already, like providing some kind of like coherent visual forward. And what the people that are trying to promote themselves as neutral, what they do is basically they provide just a commodity. What they do is they broadly identifies the opinions that are largely unreasonable and too extreme on both sides, and they publish everything in between. You know, they take, you know, the center left, the disaffected liberals, the classical liberal, the soft conservative, the traditionalist types, even like some broadly defined form of right-wingness or whatever, and they just publish everything, and they just say, you know, you could just like surf the internet and go, you know, from left-wing to right-wing publication, or like, you know, follow a bunch of people on Twitter, and you can make up your own mind like that. But instead, what we do, we provide a commodity, we put it in the same place, and, you know, we're better than you because we are open-minded, and that's kind of like the gatekeeping problem that I was trying to identify earlier.
Obviously, I mean, the fact that you can make up your own facts is an anathema, and I would really sort of ask anyone who is in a position to hire young people to go and hire young people who come in America from places like city colleges and you know, from state universities, from places where they don't have this expensive wokery, because the class element, which has been completely sort of negated by identity politics, is really something that, like many, you know, simple things, it's grounded on something that's real. And so find people who are not within this privileged bubble, and you will have made progress, because the less privilege you've got and the more you are confronted with reality, usually because it comes and punches you in the face. And again, you know, the old notion of, and it's a cliche, I know, there's, you know, the school of hard knocks. Do not knock the school of hard knocks, because that actually got results. So I would also say, first of all, facts and find out facts, and that means investigative. I'm absolutely aware that investigation is expensive. Tam Stoppard, the great playwright, wrote in Night and Day, his 1978 play about journalism, which applies to this day. And one of the many great lines in that play is, "Comment is free, but facts are on expenses." I can sit down, I can bang out a comment piece for the Telegraph, and, you know, it's 2 hours, it's not very expensive, it's me and my computer. You want to have the actual facts of what's going on in Bakhmut. You've got to send people there. You've got to get them fixer. You've got to give them hotel rooms, plane tickets. You know, you've got to pay them a salary and insurance, possibly a satellite phone, a Starlink link. I mean, facts are expensive. So this is something that you've got to sort of pick your, you know, the things where you want to investigate. But then if you break stories, people will have to mind you. And this is a very tall order. But that's one way of sort of bringing a principle of reality somewhere. It's getting, well, we got facts, you know. And unlike Groucho Marx, these are our facts. We haven't got others if you do not like the previous ones.
I think that's exactly right. The idea that opinion is much less expensive than the facts. One of the things that we hope to accomplish here in Brussels is to be the place to fill the gaps, not just for, let's say, point of view or ideology or to become the safe space, but to literally fill the gaps where reporting is either spotty, missing, misleading. And we do hope that, especially those of you who consume a great deal of media, but are also well-informed yourselves from the inside, that you do think of the European conservative as a place to fill those gaps. So for example, if you've been at a hearing or you've actually read proposed legislation as opposed to reading what somebody else tells you is in the legislation, do feel free to observe the media reporting about these things and say, you know what? This is misleading and everybody's saying it, and here's the real truth. We are literally in the back door of the European Parliament building. Our office is here in the bubble for a reason. So feel free, really, to say to the European conservative, our staff, to say, this isn't true. Or it's true, but here's the context. So I mean, we're here for a reason is the point of that, and to fill both ideological but also fact-based gaps. That's why we're here. So with just a few minutes remaining, I want to sort of draw attention to the panel that we have here, and it was chosen very carefully because we think that our panelists represent this range of experiences, points of view. We don't think that conservatism, and in fact, I'll pause with the word conservatism. Plenty of people say, oh, it's a term we shouldn't even be using these days, but it's one that we use. I think this panel represents the range of kinds of viewpoints that we want to reflect. It's not a monolith. Not everybody thinks the same way, and we think that's good. But we all, I think probably most of us in this room, look at a fundamental view of what is true, what is good, what are we here to preserve, conserve. Mario has very often, when he's talking about conservatism, pointed out that a lot of people are conservative but just don't really think about it. And this has to do very much with what Anne-Elizabeth said about class. So if you ask an ordinary person who is working very hard, trying to raise children and keep food on the table, they may or may not say that they're conservative, but if you scratch the surface, most people are fundamentally conservative because they know what's good and they know what's worth conserving, preserving. So maybe in a minute or two, each of you could talk about what you think the European conservative can do to keep that conversation going about what it is to conserve.
Okay, well, someone who's never thought of himself as a conservative, when I look at these issues today, what I see is that every issue that I really care about cuts pretty much horizontally across, that wasn't horizontal, was it? Or diagonally across the old political divides of left and right. When I think of the years that I spent campaigning for Brexit with all kinds of people of all different, despite the attempt to make out that they were all basically neo-fascists in jackboots, all kinds of people of all kinds of political persuasions. On something like the battle with trans ideology, that cuts right across old-fashioned political lines. And I think every issue that's coming up now, in the culture wars particularly, we're finding there are new divides. And we've got to be very open-minded about who we find ourselves fighting with or arguing alongside on these kind of issues. That's very, very important. But I think one thing we ought to all agree on is, what the European Conservative can do, what I hope we do with Spiked in London, is to go back to basics, to re-establish and stand up for the principles in the heart of Europe, the principles on which European civilization was built in the first place. And I think always of the standards set 350 years ago by one of the great Europeans of the Enlightenment, Spinoza, who said that in a free state, any man, and we would add, of course, any woman or any self-identifying individual. In a free state, any man may think what he likes and say what he thinks. 350 years ago, we still haven't reached that standard for a civilized society yet. In fact, if Spinoza was resurrected tomorrow and said, came out with that, says, think what you like and say what you think, he can't say that, and he'd be cancelled. So, you know, those principles are still, they're not ancient history. They're what we need to be fighting for now to bring European civilization to life.
I actually do not have much to add to what I've said, but and this is the journalist now speaking, is make this good, make this accurate, because people will pick holes in anything else. So really, I mean, learn the stupid basics of this job, which is a lot of shoe leather and a lot of, does he really mean this? And, you know, high thoughts and low cunning, and a mix of both, and make it entertaining, because nobody is forced to read the European Conservative, so it's got to be fun to read.
Yeah, I don't know necessarily if I agree with necessarily if everyone like deep down is a conservative. The question itself obviously brings up the question of what a conservative is. But I think if you define conservatism, and broadly speaking, like very, you know, polite, decent people who generally just want like normal things like a family and, you know, are not insane, basically, then I would say that most people are conservatives. But then if you are, you know, can start to define a little bit more conservatism as so like a line, being aware and aligned with nature, you know, with human nature and what human beings are and what human beings are supposed to do on a, I guess, more broad vision spectrum. I guess most people really are not. They're you know, liberalism today is basically the water we swim in. You know, we're not even aware that we're liberals. So it's just like so ingrained in the way we think, the way we express ourselves, the way we conceptualize morality. And I think like deep down, most people are just like very soft conservative at best and liberal at worst. So, yeah.
I would like to use this last minute to tell you good luck. I hope that you will make it. There's a gap to be filled for sure, but it's not always easy to find his place. That's not the same. So I hope that you will find it. I hope that you will work together with other websites that we already have in Brussels, like Brussels Report. He's doing a very good job, owned by Peter Klepp. And also, I hope that you will not make the same mistake that I left. So if you will do it, Rob and myself will knock on your door and we will tell you as a friends.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to end this panel, and you're all very welcome to this event. We're so glad to see you all, and thank you for your warm welcome to this sometimes cold environment, and keep helping us on our journey. So thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you all.
There is no break. Please stay here. I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker. I want to start by saying that as an undergraduate student in the United States, I had the guilty pleasure of having unfiltered Camel cigarettes late at night while reading, this is a scandal, The Spectator, in a darkened room with a couple friends. And this is in the late 80s. And among my favorite columns in that wonderful magazine was one by Theodore Dalrymple, such a wonderful name, Dickensian. And I would read that and Talkie, my other guilty pleasure. And those of you who read The Spectator know what I'm referring to. But Theodore Dalrymple was wonderful, charming, erudite, cranky. I said, boy, I hope I never meet the guy who writes these columns under this name. I was kind of terrified. And then one day it happened, courtesy of Lord Daniel Hannan, who introduced us. And there was this wonderful, charming, soft-spoken, lovely man who I'm so delighted to be able to call a friend today. And I said, wait, you're Theodore Dalrymple, you write these abrasive pieces in The Spectator in the spirit of Aubrenois? And says, yes, that is me. So that's all I want to say by way of introduction. I'd like to invite Anthony Daniels, Tony Daniels up here to the podium to give us a talk. And thank you for all your writings, all the inspiration, for showing us how to write such beautiful, scintillating prose. Tony, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mario. Ladies and gentlemen, I was supposed to talk about speaking truth to power, but mainly I seem to talk to myself, actually. I'm very honored to have been asked to speak to you on this auspicious occasion. And I think probably most of you, most of us, feel that we're living in proto-totalitarian times, in an atmosphere that is compounded equally of menace and absurdity. And without wishing to appear grandiose, the inauguration of an office in Brussels of the European Conservative is a small, but not, I hope, totally insignificant act of opposition, or one might even call it resistance, to a trend that many of us feel is almost unstoppable. And to give one small example of how small the mills of what might almost be called the Cultural Revolution grind, a production of Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot, in the University Theatre in Groningen in the Netherlands, has been cancelled because only male actors could be auditioned for it. And this was for two reasons. One, not a very good reason, namely that the estate of Beckett demands that all actors in the play should be male. But the second was that the requirement that all the actors should be male was a perfectly logical one, given that all the characters are male, or what used to be called male. And the theatre preferred to abandon the production rather than concede. In fact, it was forced to. Here's what the press officer of the university said to explain the decision to the world. Beckett explicitly stated that this play should be performed by men. Moving forward, times have changed. And that the idea that only men are suitable for this role is outdated and even discriminatory. We as a university stand for an open, inclusive community where it is not appropriate to exclude others on any basis. Now, I don't want to analyze the Weasley langue de bois in which this is all couched, the kind of language that we have come to expect from our cultural apparatchiks and nomenclatura, and which demonstrates that it was not the West that won the Cold War, at least in the cultural sphere, but the Soviet Union. I want only to draw attention to the last assertion, that it is not appropriate, whatever appropriate means, to exclude others on any basis. And the emphasis on any is mine. But surely it's perfectly obvious, it doesn't really need any explanation as to why this cannot be true. After all, what are auditions but a process, actually in very concentrated form, of discrimination on some basis or other? Surely people incapacitated by Parkinson's disease, for example, which is no fault of their own, or who are mute, who do not speak the language, must be discriminated against. When the press officer used the word discriminatory in the way in which the name Goldstein was used in 1984, he was employing a technique which is employed with ever greater frequency to the detriment of freedom and real thought, namely the use of words with connotation but no denotation. That is to say, words with a penumbra of association, good or bad, but with no fixed meaning, no firm connection to any concrete reality by which their truth or otherwise can be tested. In this way, accusations can never be disproved and utopian longings can never be proved to be absurd. Now, I've actually reservations about Beckett myself. I believe him to be overestimated as a writer, but that's hardly the point. If we interested ourselves only in those works with which we had no reservations, we should soon deprive ourselves of practically everything. But such purging in the name of some kind of moral purity now seems to be a major preoccupation of Western intellectuals, whose efforts, often successful, have the effect of disconnecting the young from any sense of the past other than as a period of jahiliyyah, the Islamic term for the supposed ignorance reigning before the advent of Muhammad. All this is continuing at the same time as a denial that it is happening. A few days ago, I read an article in the Guardian newspaper, which I always read. It wakes me up in the morning. It's like a cup of coffee, actually. And which one might call the house journal of the woke nomenclatura, or aspiring nomenclatura, that the real threat to freedom of thought or expression in our universities is not woke intolerance or totalitarianism, but racism and classism in alliance with the government. And yet it's commonly, if not universally, the case that aspiring academics have to subscribe to the policies, or rather ideology, of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion if they are to be considered for a position in the university. And this is so, whatever their field, and it now exists even in the hard sciences. I was speaking to an astrophysicist in France where the same thing exists. No dissension is possible, which leaves applicants who do not subscribe to what, after all, is a very thin and destructive and frankly rather boring philosophy, with a dilemma, neither arm of which is satisfactory. They can either dissemble, in which case they join the ranks of careerists, undermining their sense of their own probity, and in the process make themselves hostages to fortune, or they can abandon all hopes of an academic career, which has been their main aim in life. Well, we don't yet live under great physical threat, though this is not always entirely absent either. I once spoke at a literary festival in England in which the speaker after me was so notorious for her outspokenness, sometimes admittedly not in the best of taste, that the police said they could not guarantee her safety. Not that they tried very hard, of course, and advised her to scuttle away before she could be attacked by a masked and black balaclava helmeted mob. As for the rest of us, we were imprisoned in the venue until the police felt it safe to lead us out of the back of the building under the cover of darkness. On another occasion, I was on my way to a dinner in London when my wife and I passed a demonstration against a well-known journalist who was addressing a meeting of homosexuals and lesbians in a conference centre. It was this journalist's contention, so banal that only a handful of years ago it would not have been deemed worth stating, let alone demonstrating against, that a transsexual woman who had undergone various treatments and who lived in a certain respects as a woman was not a woman in any straightforward or literal sense. And this, incidentally, does not imply any ill usage of such people. The demonstrators, many of them masked, were transsexual activists shouting slogans against her, slogans which implied that she had no right to speak. And as my wife and I passed, we said nothing, we were just walking by, I heard someone exclaim, "Fascist." Well, my wife and I looked behind us to see who this potentially very dangerous and nasty person was. And then it dawned on me that I was the fascist. I was the person referred to as a fascist ex officio, as it were, because I was dressed in a jacket and tie, much as I am today. And as you can see, this is a very threatening form of costume. I know all fascists dress as I'm dressed. Well, as it happened, and previously unknown to me, the speaker who was being demonstrated against was a guest at the same dinner as I, and she told us that she felt that had the police not been there, not been present, she would have been physically attacked. All for having said something that would have struck most people, as I said, not very long ago, as completely banal. Of course, the question is not whether she was right or wrong, but whether she had the right to express her opinion without fear or threat of physical violence against her. And an alarming, as we've just heard, an alarming proportion of young people now think that if an opinion is morally wrong, according to their own scale of values, no one has the right to express it, and they have a corresponding duty, actually, to ensure that it is not expressed. The article in The Guardian, by denying that the problem of censorship and that the real problem was, and by claiming that the real problem was racism and classism, suggested that in fact the only solution was even more control by the apparatchik and nomenclatura intellectual class. And the problem is both widespread and multiform. Let me give you an example from France. A trained architect, Marc Perelman, who had to give up any hope of a career as a teacher of architecture or architectural history because of a book that he wrote in which he made the most obvious criticisms of the work of the fascist architect Le Corbusier, who was brilliant at self-promotion as he was incompetent technically, as was Mies van der Rohe, who incidentally had absolutely no hesitation in sucking up to the Nazis. And who Le Corbusier I'm now talking about, has probably done more to render the world ugly than any person has done in the whole history of the world. But to this day, it is difficult to criticize him in France, with the consequence that a country with a glorious immemorial tradition of architecture is now almost incapable of building anything on a large scale, or even a small one for that matter, which is anything other than an eyesore. Not only that, but at least elite taste has been completely undermined and destroyed. Patrons have been intellectually terrorized into patronizing the most egotistical and destructive architects, fearing to be thought uncomprehending of the architect's brilliant ideas. And if you want to know how brilliant architects' ideas are, I suggest you read what they write. A good example is the Luma Tower in Arles, whose architect was Frank Gehry. This huge, hideous, and vastly expensive construction in the old and beautiful town was what a large live toad would be in a plate of bouillabaisse. You can't ignore it. It's self-evidently ugly, almost unbelievably so. It's a monument raised to the ego of its designer and is, of course, far too expensive ever to undergo the only way in which it could be improved, which is demolition. The novelist Michel Houellebecq put it perfectly in his latest novel. It is the type of building that looks as if the architect was not trying to please humans, but to impress extraterrestrials with his technical prowess. And that's exactly an exact description of an awful lot of modern architecture. This monstrosity, which I'm tempted to apply the word psychopathic, has met with all but universal praise, no one daring to apply the word ugly to it. On the other hand, no one has said it beautiful either. They find ways of praising it by avoiding any aesthetic judgment. It is as if beauty had been expunged from the Platonic desiderata, as if aesthetic judgment were no longer possible or important. The question of beauty or its opposite, ugliness, is skirted round as if it were a crude joke told at a diplomatic dinner party. There is, if you like, a totalitarian silence on the subject, and I need hardly tell you how much of the fabric of urban Europe has been ruined by this silence. It is fear that maintains the silence, fear not only of the reaction of others, but fear of revealing oneself, a fear of self-exposure, which curiously enough goes along with and is perfectly compatible with endlessly narcissistically talking about oneself, but without self-revelation. Well, I think, or at least I hope, and Mario will correct me if I'm wrong, it is this kind of fear that the European conservative is perfectly calculated to combat. Though we should not be, and I'm sure we are not, deluded that it will succeed in doing so single-handed. If the terrible sickness and spiritual emptiness that is evident in our architecture, in our universities, in our music, in our theatrical productions, even in our patterns of consumption and socializing, is ever to be overcome, it will require a lot of persuasion, for it cannot be overcome by decree. We must all do what we can as well as we can, and I think that the European conservative, which sees Europe not as a giant bureaucratic entity, but as a civilizational one, will be valiant in the effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. We will now have our second and last panel, and then we'll proceed to a luncheon where I hope we can all speak and become friends. Safe travels to you, Tony. The second panel, which I referred to in my opening remarks, is basically an attempt to answer the question, why the European conservative? Why does it exist? Why is it important? So I've invited 4 of our regular contributors to join us. I'll introduce each briefly and ask them to come up. First, Sebastian Morello, who I'm happy to also now count as a friend and an inspiration. He is currently a senior editor for us and a board member. And he can speak both, and will speak both about his philosophical writings, his other contributions on hunting, on mushrooms, perhaps, on some very other interesting and unexpected topics. His background is in philosophy, as you'll discover. He was trained under Roger Scruton, and his dissertation was just recently published. I see one on the table here, Conservatism and Grace, which I'm looking forward to reading. So thank you, Sebastian, for joining us. Next is Hélène de Lausanne. There she is. Thank you, Hélène, for coming. Hélène is our Paris editor and a board member. She has many years of experience as both a journalist and an editor, but also an academic. She is one of the leading historians on Austria, on the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, on the Habsburgs, and is currently working on another book on the Habsburg family. And I've invited her to speak with us, to you, about her multifaceted work as news writer, as op-ed contributor, as essayist, reviewer, and as what we like to call our Paris hub, the hub around which many other organizations and personalities revolve as we try to expand this family, not just in Brussels, but across Europe. Next, we have Álvaro Peñas. Thank you, Álvaro, for coming. Álvaro is a prolific writer and columnist for such platforms as Deliberatio, El American, contributor to various Spanish language publications and outlets, and a new contributor for us. His interviews with interesting and quirky and very intelligent personalities from Europe and in the US have really caught our attention and the attention of a lot of our readers. So I'm delighted to have you here too, Álvaro. And finally, Jorge González Galarza, who has been with us for a few years now. Good to see you, Jorge. Thank you for coming. Jorge is the host of the Uncommon Decency podcast, which I highly recommend. You could perhaps give us the link or where to find that during your comments. It's Uncommon Decency, for those of you who have never listened to it, covers intellectual and political and policy areas, transatlantic issues, European issues. It's quite diverse in its content. Highly recommended. Jorge himself studied at University College London and finished a master's degree in political theory at in Paris, and he is a former visiting fellow at Matthias Corvinus Collegium in Budapest. And I think with that, I'll sit down and try to stimulate a little conversation. Thank you. Thank you again. You can share this microphone. All right. So, can you? This is on. Good. I think I'd like to start, basically, with a very simple question: is why do you continue to write for us? I don't want to get rid of any of you, of course, but you continue to come back. You are happy with our grueling editorial process. So what keeps you at the European Conservative? And I'd like to actually get a response from each of you. As you see, I'm testing you in public, so there's no escape. So maybe starting with Sebastian.
Well, we've talked about this before. What I think is unique about the European Conservative is that it does the old-fashioned reporting that you were referring to earlier. It does the everyday journalism. There are a number of conservative publications that are doing that. What's completely unique about the European Conservative is that it does this in such a way as to never lose sight of the larger civilizational question. There is a very acute awareness among all those involved in the project that there are essentially two dominant competing conceptions of what Europe is. There's the sort of grey, post-historical, bureaucratic conception of Europe. And there is another conception which is not, it's not very abstract, it's not overly rationalistic, it's historically based, and it looks at the organic sources of this civilization. Hellenic wisdom, the legal and imperial tradition of Rome, the low cultural, folk cultural, nation-based tradition of Europe, and how all of that was assumed into the new life offered in the Christian religion and sanctified and transformed by it. That's another conception of Europe. And it's a conception of Europe that an awful lot of people, despite huge pressure from their overlords, have not forgotten. And you can still find it once you dust off old books, or you wander around the old towns of European cities. You see it unfold in our material culture, our aesthetic tradition, our architectural tradition. And there are an increasing number of people in the West who are fed up with being told that they must stumble about in the shadow of their civilization, that they must wander about the old towns of Europe as if they are visitors from another planet, and inhabit this post-historical epoch and call it their own. They're not prepared to do that. They think that they have been robbed of their inheritance. It's wonderful that we do this day-to-day reporting and that we're cognizant of the importance of everyday affairs. But I think the real strength of the European Conservative is one, at the level of its aesthetic presentation, and two, at the level of its essays and its commentary. Because there is this unique hub now which is pushing back and thereby inducting people back into their inheritance. Now, obviously, I wouldn't want to claim that we alone are doing it, but we are a group. We're a group who have teeth. So that seems to me why there's good reason to be immensely proud of this achievement. And I'll shut up now and let somebody else talk.
Lovely comments, Sebastian. Ellen, how about you?
Why am I still working at the European Conservative?
Because I won't let you go, right?
Oh, yeah. I could give a very prosaic and blunt answer by saying it's my job. And I love my job. So that's good news. The answer to that question for me is going to be rather selfish. The European Conservative is an exceptional opportunity that was given to me to give a sense and a proper direction to my academical background. As Mario mentioned, of course I've written and I've worked for many titles for years, but originally I come from the university, from an academical circle. But I've always been obsessed by the question of being, in a way, stuck in a kind of scholastic decadence, making me writing articles that nobody would read about the passionating electoral debates in subcarpatic Ruthenia in 1911, and that kind of things that nobody cares about. And when I had the opportunity to work for the European Conservative, it was a kind of revelation to me. I can make a kind of original synthesis of what I've received as an academic, and at the same time, being constantly rooted in the contemporary life, with real stakes on politics, on law, on decisions that are shaping our everyday world. And I think that is the wonderful job that is done by the European Conservative, trusting people who are in search for truth, in search for goodness, in search for beauty, and at the same time consider that they have something to say to our world, not to be stuck in a kind of bubble, idealistic bubble that has no connection with the world of our fellow citizens. And that's, to me, the wonderful project of the European Conservative.
Thank you. Alvaro, please.
Well, for me, it's also the why I'm writing here. Because the European Conservative has the main values, the values that are important. Of course, it's truth, goodness, and beauty. It defends the truth, it defends goodness, and it's a beauty magazine. This is also very important to remark. And one thing is true, that in the moment I have started writing and collaborating with you, for me, but has been very easy to work with many people, that before it was more difficult to access, because it has a lot of prestige, this magazine, and this is a recognition of the important work it's doing. So for me, it's very important to be part of this adventure or of this project, because I think it's very necessary, especially at this moment.
Thank you, Alvaro. Wonderful comments, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, by the way. I mean, we have a network of writers across Europe and even across the Atlantic. But I'm delighted that the four of you are here. Jorge, so why do you think it's important that you continue to work with a cranky old editor like me and my wonderful team?
Well, I guess I'll just sort of like walk you through how the process of how I got drawn towards the European Conservative. I vividly remember having a call with Mario sometime in 2021 before, well, it was right in the middle of French quarantine. I was based in Paris at the time. Mario, you were not in Vienna. I vividly remember you were somewhere else, but you know, we spoke about the Mario's plans to sort of rebrand and overhaul the magazine. which eventually came to pass in the summer of 2021. But I vividly remember that day there was a piece I read on the old side. This was a much less eye-friendly side than what is now the European Conservative. But I vividly remember a piece by Alberto Fernandez, a retired ambassador, who covers and is interested in Spain. And the title of it was just so engrossing. It just captivated me instantly. It said Spain with a spine, and it was a piece about Vox, the conservative party in my home country of Spain. So that I think really instantly got me interested in the magazine. It was so witty, so intelligent, so just sort of out of the box that that I instantly became interested in what Mario was putting together with the new project for the magazine. A few months later, from Madrid, I freelanced my first piece for the magazine. It was a piece about Alain Finkielkraut, whom you got to edit yourself, Mario. And I think if you were to ask me why, or what has kept me in the orbit of the European Conservative, why I keep, even just not only as a writer, but as a reader as well, why I keep getting my news and my commentary from Eurocon, I think really it comes down to the following. It's about, I mean, as much as I agree with Sebastian that it's about keeping your eye on sort of the brunt work of reporting whilst not losing sight of the civilizational struggle we're in. I think there's a lot of truth to that. But in my sense, I think the strength of this magazine really lies in the commentary and in the opinion. I think we have a long way to go on the news side, and we're making great strides, and we're doing incredible work. When you read some of these news pieces about these tiny niches that nobody else is reporting about, the money that the EU gives to Islamist organizations, for instance, things that should totally encompass the entire news cycle, but nobody else other than Eurocon is reporting. So again, I think the news is a really important part. It's where I see the largest opportunity for growth. But if you were to ask me what keeps me coming back daily as part of my news diet to the Eurocon, that would have to be the opinion, the commentary, the essays, the op-eds. That's where I think the strength of the magazine is at the moment.
Thanks, Jorge. So I should say the following. The modest success of this media project to now is actually rather improbable, because many years ago, I remember quite vividly a conversation with several people in London who had launched their own successful magazines, and I was describing to them the kind of venture we were about to embark on. And I said, yes, art, and political philosophy, and book reviews. And they looked at me like I was crazy, and they said, no, it'll fail from the start. You can't combine art and politics. Never mind that there are many wonderful paintings through the centuries that reflect political themes. And I pushed back. All right, rather I ignored them, and I went ahead. And so that's what I mean, the rather improbable origins. I've always wanted to combine, to reintegrate everything that's been fragmented, to reintegrate things like art and politics and history and literature and philosophy and poetry. So that is really the spirit behind the European Conservative. So I want to ask each of you, again, perhaps maybe now working down from Jorge down to Sebastian, how would you try to explain this project to someone who's never seen it, never seen the website or the print journal? How would you try to convince someone that this reintegration of these various disparate themes can indeed work and is not only nice to look at, but actually fundamentally important to the task of restoring our civilization?
Well, I think if I was to sort of market this project to someone who has not looked at the website, read the print issue yet, I would just perhaps say that this is the first major attempt, at least that I'm aware, this is the first major attempt to create a single English-speaking conversation about the major events, phenomena, trends that are shaping the continent. I know that the effort has been made in the past through multilingual outlets. I know that people in the past, some of whom, I mean, the project will be familiar to some of the people in the room, but others have in the past tried to create multilingual portals, outlets to cover sort of the same news items and the same policy items in several different languages. This is not, the Eurocon is not about doing that. Eurocon is about creating a single conversation in English. So it demands of readers at least a basic grasp and a basic level of English, but it really creates a single sort of conversation. I think this is really what makes it strong. And then obviously, in addition to that, there's the fact that the conversation is very highbrow. It's philosophically a very sort of highbrow, cultured, call it what you will. But it's to me, it has to do with, if you want to read about what's happening in Europe, if you want to read about the EU and its member states, if you want to read about European culture, literature, the arts, this is a magazine that covers all of that. Come on.
I also write in a Spanish magazine which is called Disidentia, and the motto of this magazine is this for people who like reading. Yes, and I think this is also appropriate for the European conservative, because it's if you like reading, you are going to love this magazine. And as Jorge said, you have everything inside. So you can find everything you need, everything you want to deep in history, in culture, tradition, architecture, everything. And of course, you can find things which are at the moment, yes, as we were speaking about, he was speaking about the Watergate or these things, yes, these scandals. Or, for example, in this last number, we can see what is happening in the US Army with this project of making the more diverse or more sensitive the army, yes, which is really, really, really sad thing. So I think you can find many things there. So for many different people can find interesting things. And of course, the quality. I think this is quite important, because we live in a world where all is ugly, and it's more or less like but done on, and the how is done the magazine, how is the presentation, everything. It looks, just something you want to take in your hands.
So that's an interesting exercise, the elevator pitch for the European conservative. How to convince your interlocutor that he has to read the Eurocon in 5 minutes or less. Well, I cannot use the English language argument, because if I speak to the European conservative, it's going to be mainly to French people, and their first question is going to be, why isn't it published in French? So I'm not going to use this argument. I think that I would use the argument, because I presume it's the thing that I share with my interlocutor. There is another Europe, and you know it. You know that there is another Europe than the one that is embodied in Brussels. And this Europe, it is something that speaks to your heart, that is something perhaps made of passion, of love for your land. And it's almost unconscious, but it lives in you. And this Europe, you can find it in the European conservative. You can find there a coherent world, which is made of different identities, which is perhaps not exactly yours, since I'm speaking, for example, to a French guy, but with whom you share many things, many values, many images, many dreams, many roots. And it's not an abstract idea. It lives, and it lives in a review, and this review is the European conservative. And you're going to find all the things you love nowadays in that Europe that exists apart from Brussels. Art, philosophy, history, a common heritage, and all that kind of things.
Sebastian, sell the magazine. What would you tell a friend who's skeptical about this strange creation?
Well, I think this point about it not being an abstract thing is the key here. Famously, Fukuyama wrote his book, The End of History. There's been a lot of debate ever since about what he really meant by that. In any case, earlier there was a lot of talk about the narrowing of the mind, conformism, and so on. That's part of the story at the moment, but it's only part of the story. There's something else going on at the moment, which is an awakening, a realization that we are drowning in an age of ideology. And we can't live like that anymore. And there are different ways you can handle that situation. One way is to try and foment competing ideologies in the face of those that are dominant. Another way is to return to concrete realities, to the hard work of understanding your history, understanding your political tradition, cultivating the necessary virtues to function in this world, develop deep relationships. One of the reasons I write so much about things like hunting and local festivals and these sort of concrete things where communities are established or they renew their kinship is precisely because if those who have conservative sympathies handle the current situation by simply developing competing ideologies, then we're never going to get out of the rut that late modernity is plunging us into ever more. Earlier Spinoza was mentioned. I happen to think that the European tradition didn't begin with Spinoza. I think it started to end with people like Spinoza. I'm not someone who champions modernity or any of its unfelicitous stages. I think that it's the reduction of the political conversation to competing abstractions that has ruined our civilization and that is now theatrically conveyed in late modernity's architecture, late modernity's music, late modernity's way of forming relationships through faceless online avatars and all of this this sort of dystopian nightmare in which we've found ourselves. So what one can say about the European conservative is that it has no ideology. It looks at events, it meditates upon history, it presents beauty, it tries to foment a serious conversation about the concrete, the existential, the non-transferable. And for those who are fed up of just being battered about in the arena of competing ideologies, there's an alternative. The European conservative, again, is unique in offering that alternative, it seems to me. I'm very touched that we're in a room with various fox hunting prints around here. The Balmoral room. Interestingly enough, Scotland has just passed a new legislation banning fox hunting. So this is it's like a sort of subtle way of trolling Scotland, which goes to show how Brussels treats its friends, in a way. But it's these sorts of things. It's our artistic tradition, our pastimes, our way of renewing our covenant with one another and with our national stories that we actually have to return to in order to. We're stuck in a paradigm. We're stuck in a paradigm of competing ideologies, and the European conservative is an escape route out.
Right. And what we need is a paradigm shift, right? Some Kuhnian revolution.
Mario, I think it's important to in this moment that I think many or most of people has realized that it's not possible to change things politically or to win politically if you don't first have a change in the cultural. So I think for that reason now it's more important than ever that we have this initiative, this project, because it's like the ammunition for this cultural war. I mean, if people does not like this expression, cultural war, but I think really it is, yes. So it's something we have to change, because after that, you cannot change anything. You can go to power in politics, but if your society is totally, driven by these political correct ideas, they can choose you because you are going to change economy, but in the end, you are going to go down again to the abyss. Yeah.
Right. Well, that reminds me of the widely quoted Andrew Breitbart, who we all know that saying, right? Politics is downstream from culture, meaning that we have to, as you just said, Alvaro, focus on those cultural aspects, not necessarily first, but that recognizing that is the context or the ground in which everything else, economic and political activity and matters, takes place. So it's a good reminder. I want to focus on the linguistic aspect that was already mentioned. The fact that it's primarily or only in English for the moment. And I want to say this, though, as a preface. I was raised, I'm very sensitive to the linguistic issue because I was raised speaking Spanish in the United States. And the moment I would walk into my house, English was not allowed. My mother imposed that rule, and she would get quite irate if I started speaking English. And so in the house, it was Spanish or Italian. And there was this immense pressure on me and my sister to try to learn many languages, as many as possible. Unfortunately, to this day, I can stare blankly at a German text and maybe make out one or two words. So I'm still working on the German. But all that is just to point out to everyone how sensitive I am to the linguistic aspect. So when we were conceiving of the European Conservative, we obviously recognize that we no longer live in a world in which French is the international language. Sadly, I know. There are some of us who would like to go back to that era, or Spanish. And we recognize, well, a certain kind of English dominates. And it's sadly, Sebastian, not British English. It's American English. Because of the entertainment industry and the mass media, because of the business schools and the elite universities in America. So American-style English, I think they call it international business English, is dominant. So our journal had to use the language that was most in use. It's sad, and I would love a multilingual platform. So my question is there room in Europe for a multilingual platform? I think you were referring to The Conservative that Aker used to put out, or still does. Or is one pan-European conservative journal enough in English? Or do we need some other kind of model? What do you think, Jorge?
Well, actually, I think you're already sort of getting around this riddle by having people, and just to give one example, such as Hélène, for instance, in French, who is also writing in French, but who, her readers can also access her commentary in English in your magazine. And this is not an either-or question. I mean, to me, this is not either having, just a second ago, it sounded like you were voicing the critique of, for instance, a lot of people in French conservative circles who are very resentful of sort of Anglo-imperialism. Everything has to be in English. All of the newspapers are in English, etc. And I think you can get around that by having people in each country from those countries to write in English, so that even their fellow Frenchmen or their fellow Spaniards can also access content of the highest quality, really. I mean, content they could otherwise also get in Spanish, but it just happens that we are printing it in English because we're trying to create this single conversation across the entire continent. So I think this magazine is already doing it in the least sort of in the best of ways, really, by having people from each country. I mean, I hold no pretense. I just gave a couple of examples. I think Alvaro can also speak to this in sort of his niche of covering Spanish news. But it seems to me that the way forward is to cultivate teams of people who are covering the realities of those countries from those countries and making that content accessible to as many people as possible in the only way you can do that, which is English. And you're already doing this, so.
Well, as you know, I cooperate with different media. For example, in America and the US, they write in English and in Spanish. And I cooperate with Slovenian or any other countries, Croatian also. So the truth is, of course, that you need the English as the main language, because when I made an article, I sent to my friend in Croatia in English, not in Spanish, of course. But I think in the digital area, yes, you have to explore this, because now people is things that happen in a country is happening in the next country, or even 3,000 miles away. Yes, like for example, I have found this interview with Alejandro Peña from Venezuela about Sao Paulo Forum. He describes how these people put money in the European left. and the Spanish left, the Italian left, the Greek left, and the Slovenian left. So it's the same case, the same people. You can find people who is working for the embassy of Venezuela, and now is MP in the parliament. So the problems are the same. So we have to connect, to share things. And I think the good thing is that digital area now we can work a lot. And I think we have to explore this kind of work. Of course, in the magazine, I agree with Jorge. I think it must be in English because it's at the moment the main language.
Yes, as a French speaker, I would say, of course, I dream of a time when French was the common language. As an historian, I'm always moved when I see that among elites, among well-bred people for centuries, people used to speak in French. Perhaps you don't know that detail, but Kaiser Franz Joseph, the Austrian Empire, was writing his personal letters to his mother in French, which is extraordinary. Of course, it's much more practical when you are an historian because it facilitates your research, but that's another matter. But anyway, this time is gone. I don't know if it's gone forever, but it's gone. And I think that one of the strengths of the European conservative is that it has understood that this time is gone. And one of our strengths is not to be outrageously nostalgic. And nowadays, it is a fact. We can deplore it, but it's a fact that the common language is English. And we have to use it in an intelligent way to make people conscious that we have something in common. For the moment, it's English. It used to be French. It used to be Latin, we may say, too. And a part of my job as responsible of the Paris hub or the French hub is to try to convince conservative people in France that it's not a betrayal to read something in English. They are not going to lose their soul and to burn into hell if they try to read something in English. And it's something good and important because they have to realize that they are not alone. And it is one of the main problems of multilingual. Of course, it's the eternal story of the Tower of Babel, is that we are stuck in our own bubbles. And we do not realize that we have something common with people. And it's an important part of my job to try to say to French conservative, you are not alone. And it would be highly profitable to your fight to know that there are other people who are thinking just like you. We share a common view on many important topics. And for the moment, yes, we may deplore it, but it's a fact. It's in English. And so what?
And Sebastian. No Latin.
Well, I would.
There have been Latin publications.
Yeah.
I've seen them.
Yeah, I would say that I'm sympathetic to the French bias. Edmund Burke has a wonderful passage in the Reflections in which he talks about the importance of France's civilizing mission and how it bestowed its religious system and its order of manners upon the courtly institutions of Europe, then filtered down its wonderful gift of chivalric romanticism and so on to the world. So yes, I would say that were we to think too much in the French language, we might risk adopting thinking in the terms of French politics, which would be really awful for everyone. But one of the advantages of sticking to the English language is that it enables us to shift back and forth from the conversations that are happening on either side of the Atlantic. So whilst this is the European conservative, I think we have to be very cognizant of what's going on over in the United States, because it has one of the last remaining very forceful, very robust and confident conservative movements in the world. And in fact, it's now such a threat to the incremental liberal takeover of that republic that all of the worst sort of ways are being used to tarnish it. I think everyone was amazed to watch President Biden give that address with the backdrop of red lights surrounded by US Marines in order to talk about the existential threat of MAGA Republicans. You know, this is just half the nation who think differently to him. That's what he was referring to. The reason why they're having to do these sort of hammy theatrical performances is because the conservative movement in the US, which differs from the conservative traditions over on the continent, but there is a certain family resemblance and kinship, is really aggressive, really confident, and really robust. And we over here might have one or two things to learn.
Very well. The next question could raise some delicate issues, because I want to get into the whole topic of what is too conservative, or what kind of materials or content do we not include. Now, but I want to start again, as I've been doing all morning, with a little personal aside. And it had to do at university again, where I was reading certain books of political theory. And again, as I mentioned in my opening comments, I was told, you can't read that stuff. That's dangerous. Well, how do you develop a discernment of things if you don't read and then develop good criteria to judge good and bad, as I said this morning? So in the journal, we have published things over the past several years that have gotten us in some hot water, in trouble. I'm not ashamed, nor have I apologized for these things. One of those, for example, was on the website regarding the tricky situation in Ukraine. We've not taken a position. We recognize that there is sadly broad or deep divisions on the European right and on the American right. And we think it's a tragic and delicate situation. So we had someone contribute a piece, a Washington policy person, no friend to Russia, and she wrote an op-ed saying, well, maybe it's time to talk about having some kind of truce. And immediately we were accused of being Putin apologists, which, as we say in America, blew my mind. I couldn't understand that reaction. More recently, as we were preparing this journal, and there's an essay in there by Peter Krasniewski, an American theologian, historian, taught many years in Austria. He's a traditionalist Catholic. And he has a vigorous critique of some aspects of some encyclicals and documents and actions taken by certain people in the Vatican. And one of our editors privately wrote to me and said, I'm very uncomfortable with this. It shouldn't appear. And I had to remind him that we're in the business of exploring the various rights, the various traditionalist movements. We're in the business of exploring these and allowing other people to discern, decide for themselves. So the question for the panelists is, are there third rails, no-go areas, cordon sanitaire, right? Are there things beyond which or about which we should not write about? And what are those things? And let me just add this comment, and I know I'm going on too long for a moderator, but I do have control of the microphone right now. That's my one sign of authoritarianism, that I'm controlling the microphone. My interest with the European conservative was always to go beyond the Anglo-American Burkean tradition, because there's so many interesting people and phases and books from the continent. And that has displeased my libertarian friends sometimes, and it's displeased other traditionalist, fusionist conservatives in the United States. But I think it's a valuable thing to do. So back to the panelists then. What is the boundary? What are the outer limits of what we can write about, if there are any? I mean, perhaps we don't. We've heard all morning about the right and the necessity to explore diverse opinions, even those dangerous ones, as Mick said. Jorge, what do you think?
Well, I think to start with, this really ties nicely into Witold's earlier point about policing our own side, right? This is not only about sort of policing, where the latest shenanigans of the left, but also really patrolling, where does conservatism veer into something that is we're no longer comfortable with, right? I think my sort of knee-jerk reaction to that would be stay out of conspiracies, stay out of anti-Semitism, stay out of neo-Nazi radical groups. But other than that, I'm actually really happy that the European conservative has gotten a few pieces about, say, Carlismo, for instance, which is an arch-conservative, almost sort of ultra a nationalist tradition in Spain, but it's one that really deserves to be heard about and known a little better. So I think, now what I think was really interesting about your question, Mario, is the issue of the war and the fact that you got into hot waters for publishing a realist piece saying, we should strike a peace deal. I think this issue of the war is really a test case for whether or not we are achieving what we set out to do. Because this is the issue that is dividing conservatives as we speak. This is the issue where you've got Poland on one side and Hungary on the other. Their positions are really incompatible, have nothing to do with one another. And whether or not the reason I think it's a test case is because this magazine has to be a space for the two sides to come around the same table and lay out their case, why it is that we should, why do the Poles think that we should do everything in our hand to defeat Russia? Why do they want to take back Crimea? Why does Hungary want to shield the Europeans from the consequences of the war? This is the place where these arguments have to be heard, and whether or not we succeed as a magazine for all conservatives in Europe will be proved in issues like this one.
If I can just jump in and just remind everyone that we had actually a very interesting give and take over Yoram Hazony's statement of principles. That was published about a year and a half ago through his Edmund Burke Foundation. Yoram Hazony, if you don't know him, he's an Israeli political philosopher, a fascinating thinker, very clear mind. And he put together a statement of principles of what conservatives around the world should believe in. But it was very American because he studied in the U.S. Again, he became Americanized, I would say. And there was pushback from some Europeans. Many Europeans didn't want to sign the statement of principles, completely understandable. But we had several responses to that statement of principles. And that's, among friends. These are all people on the center right, on the right wing of things, having a civil discussion among themselves, pushing back, disagreeing, and I loved it. It was wonderful. And more importantly, we started getting fan mail from people saying, we thought you were ideologues, but now this is really refreshing to see this kind of debate, that you're allowing this debate. So Alvaro, back to the question then, are there limits, outer edges or things we should not dive into?
For me, the limit, the red line is propaganda. When you start to make propaganda, because I have seen this, especially with the war, that I collaborate with different media. I don't mind if they agree in every point, because this is impossible, of course. But I have to leave to cooperate with some media because they were just doing war propaganda. So I think this is not possible. You have to tell what is happening. You have to make people understand. Of course, this war is true. It has divided the right, but you have to explain the positions. In Spain, usually the right is more pro-Russia than pro-Ukraine. But you have to try to explain people why people in Ukraine think this, or why people in Poland think that, or why people in Hungary think another thing. And so for many people, they do this quite easy. If you are in this side, now you are a globalist. If you are in that side, now you're a communist. So this is not the issue. You have to explain, and you have to tell what is happening. So I think what you cannot do never is to allow to be a propagandistic, because you are lying. So you are losing the light. Yes. So you cannot do that. And I think that work, because I have published with you in interview, for example, with Ukrainian advisor. So I think you have to show these different opinions that two people can think and read and can understand. And of course, for example, in Spain, it's really funny that, for example, many people like Poland before. Poland was the best. Poland was the best country in the world, how to defend the frontier. Now Poland is a NATO country, is going to enter, I don't know, like a colony of the United States. This kind of mentality, this is not true. But people does not know history of Poland, so they don't understand why Poland has taken these positions. The same can happen with Hungary. Yes, so people have to know these things. And I think this is important to share this, all these opinions and all this history and things.
Yes, I perfectly agree with this term of propaganda as the ultimate boundary. What I appreciate in our articles about the war in Ukraine is that nobody wrote in the European conservative team, Putin is a god. But nobody wrote either, Zelensky is the new Achilles. It's very balanced between the two. And that's very important because, as you mentioned, the case of for Poland, for example, it is here that it has a sense to be a conservative review with an historical background. As you say, you cannot understand the present Polish position in the international situation if you do not know Polish history. And you cannot understand either the Hungarian position if you don't know the Hungarian history. And there are very special relationships with the Russians and episodes in their history. And that's why it's interesting and important to have a conservative view in such matters. And propaganda, I think, here is indeed the real limit. I would say that what I greatly appreciate in the European conservative, it is its ability to generate healthy controversies. We do not have an official line, or else it would not be possible to have in the same team an English writer and a French writer. And we do not have an official line, but we have common values, and that's the most important. And it reminds me of a conversation we had both a few months ago. You mentioned the fact that what was important for you at the European Conservative was to gather good people. And it's a kind of motto for me now, because when I read an article and when I'm writing something, how do I consider being a good journalist, almost in the moral sense of the term, and which means to be balanced, not to be tempted by propaganda, and to search for truth. And that must be a kind of compass for us, I think.
I'm so glad you emphasize that, because that is increasingly important to me. Gathering good people, not good in the sense of skills, obviously, but good, fundamentally good people, charitable, kind, generous. And I think that is made manifest in many of our activities. Sebastian, any thoughts on that original question of mine?
Well, first, if I may, I have to slightly disagree with Jorge.
No, that's not allowed.
Yeah. This thing of sticking away from conspiracy theories. I actually published a piece in the European Conservative last year called "In Defense of Conspiracy Theories." Look, conspiracies are part of how to understand history. Okay, Julius Caesar died because there was a conspiracy against him. Jesus Christ died because there was a conspiracy against him. You can't understand Macbeth if you don't at least accept that conspiracy is part of analyzing the sequence of events. All conspiracy means is that when groups of people agree with one another, they might make plans, right? That's what conspiracy means. And sometimes it's not expedient to reveal all those plans to those outside the group of those who agree with each other. We do this all the time, right? My children and wife and I conspire constantly, right? That's how we survive in a liberal world that hates our values, okay? Conspiracy is part of human communities and reality. And people who don't like us make plans, they conspire, and sometimes we find out those plans, right? Now, when we find out those plans and we talk about them, we're called conspiracy theorists, right? But very frequently, the mainstream press will fess up to the fact that this was going on a year later when they think it's no longer controversial. So I'm very uncomfortable with this idea that we should stick away from conspiracy theories. Regarding some of the things for which you've received private emails, take the situation. Ooh, I think Ukraine's been covered enough, but take the situation in the ecclesiastical authorities in Rome at the moment, right? There is a robust conservative case to make, that one may make, that the Vatican and the Curia has been largely taken over by hyper-progressivist ideologues who are frustrating the lives of a lot of their co-religionists, and in fact are now trying to destroy the religious commitments and ways of life of those who simply want to worship in the same way as everyone, all of their co-religionists did for at least the last 1600 years. We're not a Catholic publication. We are a conservative publication. Just because many of us happen to be practicing Catholics, not all of us, but many of us, we don't take our orders from the Curia. And when hyper liberal, anti-conservative initiatives unfold within not just the Roman Catholic Church, but any religious denomination or affiliation, we will criticize it because we hate that sort of thing. So that is that seems to me totally reasonable. Where shouldn't we go? I have always thought that race is a complete dead end when it comes to making political arguments. I understand that, you know, in England, the second largest city in England, Birmingham, is now 60% Muslim, right? That deeply distresses me, but not on the grounds of skin pigment, right? It's not a racial issue for me that we're dealing with here. It's a civilizational issue. It's a question of the repudiation of our settled way of life and our history. So it seems to me that there are a lot of people who would call themselves right-wing, who want to root their political arguments in materialist categories like race and ethnicity, rather than in history and civilization. And that, to me, is, again, to return to the paradigm of competing materialistic ideologies. It's a total dead end, and I'm pleased that the Eurocon has never been tempted to promulgate that sort of thing.
There's perhaps just a slide. I guess I'll add a little bit of nuance to what I said earlier, but I really like Sebastian's point about Islam, because, and this is a point that we should consistently make when we're talking about Islam as a faith. We should make a distinction between Islam as a political sort of phenomenon and the people who profess the Muslim faith. We should really differentiate those two things. And when you do that, your pieces or your writings or your speeches no longer come across as Islamophobic. They cannot be construed as such, because you're not going against the people who are actually professing that faith. But in terms of the conspiracies, I wanted to maybe just get Sebastian's thoughts on just one example. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong, for instance, with raising the alarm about George Soros. There's all the evidence in the world showing that Soros and his network are working to undermine national sovereignty, undermine the nation state, and he's building up a network to that effect with incredible means. What I disagree with is spotlighting his Jewish origin. I think that's a step too far, because I think it's almost ironic how it's beside the point. Yeah. And it's also ironic how, in fact, I think one of the things that I think a lot of people in Hungary and across Europe find sort of really ironic about Soros is that he is not a practicing Jew. He's not sort of the idea of a Jew that many people have, and especially of sort of the Orthodox community. So just spotlighting his Jewish origin is beside the point, I think. But I agree with you. I think conspiracies as such are. I mean, there's nothing wrong with raising the alarm about how people can have parallel interests and operate in the same direction. I think but there's a shade of difference. When you get into race, when you get into religion, I think that's when, at least for the magazine, I think would be good to stay away from that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Regarding Soros and like-minded people, I just want to point out that in Washington, D.C., there's a fascinating research center called Capital Research Center. And what they've been doing is researching all sorts of hedge fund managers and Silicon Valley millionaires and foundations, all those that are not Soros, and linking them and showing where the money is going. And this is one of the areas that we hope to do through the Brussels office, this kind of investigative reporting on the dark money on the left, because we always hear about, oh, the dark money on the right, the Christian right in Europe, and there's always these alarm bells, and Open Democracy website continually publishes this kind of nonsense. But no one has ever, as far as I know, published or done research on the dark money on the left. And they are extensive networks of charitable foundations. It's very interesting. I mean, I don't think we have to be afraid of them, but we need to know where things are. We need to know what the truth is. So I don't think we've been controversial enough in our comments in this panel. So let me go back to the issue of propaganda. And I'll tell you why. Because over the years, we've published what I thought were some very interesting essays and interviews and profiles of people like Santiago Abascal, the head of Vox party, people like Nicholas Fest, an MEP for AfD, that's the party you're supposed to not talk about or associate with in Germany. But these are eloquent men, very intelligent, and we've published other materials that are from one party or another, Chega in Portugal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And some people have thought that makes us propagandists. In my mind, giving Santiago Abascal an English language platform to set out his views makes us basically a proper media organization. We're allowing his views, his ideas, his opinions to be disseminated beyond Spain, right? Who else is publishing this material in English? Again, the linguistic aspect. So my question regarding propaganda, oh, and by the way, someone in this audience this morning tweeted about this event and said, the fetish-linked publication has arrived in Brussels, and alarm bells and all this fear. Why would she say that? I have no idea. Oh, well, we're registered in Budapest, but that's a matter of convenience. Number one, it's the only safe space in Europe for conservative views. Number two, it's a pretty good place, favorable terms to set up a nonprofit. I looked at Austria where I live, and oh, it's terrible. The Austrians are really oppressive when it comes to this kind of stuff, setting up a company or a nonprofit. Anyway, whoever that was in this audience who tweeted that, you're wrong, talk to me afterwards. I mean, we do publish materials from different political parties. We are not partisan. We don't endorse any particular party. What we have done is attack the Tory party for basically losing its spine. Anyway, so propaganda, good topic. I think we can move towards the end of this panel on this topic. So the question is, what, is propaganda good or bad? Is simply publishing something by a political party representative propagandistic? And it looks like you're ready to say something.
The question of our relationships with the parties is very interesting to my mind, because it is precisely one of our strengths. It is that we speak about the parties, because we could be a publication speaking only about eternal truth of conservatism through ages, but that would fill perhaps one issue or two, but it wouldn't help us to understand the world in which we live. And nowadays, well, conservatism is a fight, and it has several ways of fighting, and perhaps Chega is one of them, perhaps the Rassemblement National is one of them, perhaps the FPE is one of them. We don't know. We are searching for it. Of course, there are defaults everywhere, but there are interesting things in those parties. And the fact that we get interested in these parties shows that we are deeply rooted in our everyday life, in our everyday world. And that's that's the way I think we can connect our ideals to our changing world and not being, just like I mentioned a few minutes ago, in an abstract bubble. So keep on doing that.
Thank you. Encouraged.
You mentioned Santiago Abascal. Okay, it's the leader of the third party in Spain, and the true leader of the conservatism in Spain, because in the Partido Popular there are some people, but sadly, usually they are not conservative. It's a right without right, I used to say, yes. And of course, this is not propaganda. This is something you have to do, because you have to be in the reality of the countries, what is happening, what are the news, what are the political problems. So the propaganda will be, yes, I just publish, I don't know, any advice of what they are going to do this meeting or another, you know, like a paid announce. Yes, this is another thing. But you have to speak with politicians, and you have, because of course, we talked before, there is no political win without a cultural win. But it's also the same. The cultural needs the political win to change the society.
Sebastian or Jorge, any thoughts?
Well, just continuing the theme of me disagreeing with everyone. I said to you yesterday, I think it was over dinner, I think we should be in the business of propaganda. For me, it's not a dirty word. The Roman Catholic Church used to have an institution called Propaganda Fide. I mean, it still exists under a different name now. It means to promulgate. As we were saying earlier, we're not a neutral movement. We identify certain things as good, and we then promulgate them as good. That seems to me, unless there's a different working definition at play here, that seems to me what characterizes propaganda. Most of the dominant propagandists today identify other things as good. So we have to give a different story. And part of that is promulgation, it's propaganda. It seems to me that the kind of focus you put on not only conveying a particular message, but also the importance of rhetoric, in the true sense of the word. You know, Cicero said, your speech must be beautiful to make the truth of it all the more evident. Well, that is part of the craft of propaganda. You take what you identify to be good and true, you make it beautiful and attractive in your presentation of it. This is why also we think so much about the aesthetic presentation of the journal. It must be beautiful. These are all propagandistic impulses, and thoroughly wholesome ones, it seems to me.
Absolutely, I happen to agree. Jorge, final comments on this.
My parting thoughts are just going to be to reaffirm what has already been said, but I think, look, this goes back to the motto or the blurb of the magazine, and I think it says something along the lines of, we're here to examine the various shades of conservative, reactionary, and right-wing thought in all their bewildering nuance, right? I mean, sometimes in some countries, conservatism will snugly fit into a pre-existing partisan vehicle. Sometimes there will be a party which, beyond any doubt, is the Conservative Party. I'm actually, a really interesting thought, Alvaro. I'm not convinced that Vox can claim that label quite yet, but at least you could have asked, whenever we get a chance to interview with Santiago Abascal next, we can ask him about the Macarena Olona scandal or some of the scandals that are rocking the party. But I think generally, in other cases, there will not be a clear contender. I mean, I think, Hélène, I was really curious whether you were going to take Zemmour or Le Pen's side in the French election. But in that particular case, there was no real sort of standard bearer, right? So I think it really depends on countries. I think propaganda is fine when we can see that our ideas are being advanced by a particular party. But I think generally that is not the case.
Very good, thank you. Before I ask for a round of applause for our panelists, I want to conclude with this. The new edition, which you'll see in the back, has Otto von Habsburg on the cover, and there's a special section inside dedicated to the great late man. There's an essay by him, there's an interview, a speech by Ed Fulner about Otto von Habsburg. Thank you, Sebastian. Why? Why is Otto von Habsburg so important to us? I'll tell you very briefly. Because in the 50s, when he realized how the many Western nations were turning their backs on Francoist Spain, and they were being marginalized and pushed aside, he set up an organization called SEDI. In English, it would be the European Documentation and Information Center. Very non-threatening name. And it was through this organization that he organized an annual meeting, usually at El Escorial, where he would gather intellectuals and policymakers and writers from across Europe and across the Atlantic to have a conversation about different topics, about Africa and the challenge of development, about Christian democracy and its future. Very interesting, important themes. But it was also a way to keep Spain in the community of nations, in this broad dialogue. Fantastic initiative. So that's one of the reasons we've dedicated this section to him. It also happened to be his 110th birthday a few months ago. But for us, he represents that very civilized approach to exploring ideas, to talking to everybody, to having conversations, and not allowing others to tell us, oh, that's propagandistic, and that's being a shill for some regime, and that is not allowed. So thank you. A round of applause for our panelists. Thank you. I'll ask you to stay here, and then we will wrap up and conclude. I'll let people descend this way. Thank you. We end with, I think quite appropriately, some comments from a man who I grew up admiring. There were two heroes, well, three, including my father, number one, my hero. Number two, actually, my grandfather, a journalist and diplomat. John O'Sullivan at National Review, and these men were in my pantheon of heroes. A few years ago, I had a chance to finally meet John O'Sullivan, and then to collaborate on something with him. And then he called me up one day to ask for advice on a good book reviewer for a particular topic. And then I called him another time for advice on a good essayist on some topic or another. And pretty soon, a friendship developed. And I can't believe I can use the word friendship to describe the thing I have with John O'Sullivan. As I said, this man I grew up as a teenager, admiring, putting on a pedestal. He's still on a pedestal, mind you, you are, John, but you are a friend and continue to be an inspiration for me and so many other journalists and writers in Europe and in the Americas. So John, without further ado, you have the podium, and thank you.
Good. Ladies and gentlemen, I always like to begin a talk, ladies and gentlemen, because some of you may not be aware that in recent years, the left and the cancel culture can be summed up in the fact that people have now been dismissed for addressing the passengers on a train over the public address system as ladies and gentlemen. That is an interesting, the interesting reason given was this phrase was not inclusive. Well, of course, it's hard to think of a phrase that is more inclusive because it treats everybody in hearing of the remark as ladies and gentlemen. That is to say, it extends to them the courtesy of treating them as people of equal weight and value in the community. And although there may be some people, alas, in the audience who are not ladies and gentlemen, nonetheless, they are included in the appellation. And I like to, it reminds me too of the fact that a late Soviet era joke about how the Communist Party would announce its own dissolution. And all the dissidents who were discussing this were just wondered how it would be done. It was such a humiliation to think 70 years had ended in this catastrophe. And one said, well, I know what will happen. They won't announce that communism has collapsed at all. We'll simply turn on the radio one morning and the announcer, instead of saying comrades, will say, ladies and gentlemen. That would have been the sign of a revolution. Now, it is interesting that that particular phrase is regarded by our culture, our cancel culture, as important, which is both silly but also a sinister expression of wokeness, prohibiting, as I say, a phrase that includes everybody and treats them as being on the same level. Now, I want to begin, however, with the discussions this morning about some crimes against journalism. The first is a fairly recent sin, but it encapsulates a lot of other sins, and that is the open abandonment of objectivity. I don't know if many of you have seen the recent article in the Washington Post by Leonard Downey, its managing editor for many years, now a professor of journalism at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. I think there's a certain symmetry there, but still, wrote an article in the Post on beyond objectivity. He said, I never understood what objectivity meant. I didn't consider it a standard for our newsroom. Now, he's not really being honest there, to be fair to him. He actually says in the next sentence, my goals for journalism were instead accuracy, fairness, non-partisanship, accountability, and the pursuit of truth. And if all those aims were sought and achieved by the Washington Post, which I wouldn't myself concede, but if they were, that would be a very good working definition of objectivity. Now, of course, it means something slightly different to that. And since he did ask to be informed on what objectivity meant, let me help him. When a journalist approaches a story, we begin, or we should begin, our search on the grounds that we start from a position of relative ignorance. We don't know the story, and we don't know, therefore, the sides there are which we might take. What we do is search for the main facts and question both sides about them, and as many independent witnesses as we can find. We very rarely end a story on the same neutral note that we began it. Why? Well, if objectivity is our aim in our investigation and how we conduct it, it may not be fully achievable. In fact, it almost certainly won't, only to God. We may feel indignation if our story is one of injustice, but we shouldn't allow that indignation to distort our perception, even if it fuels our activity. And impartiality is where we should end up, having looked at all the evidence. As I say, impartiality, having looked at all the evidence without fear or favor, having given both sides or all sides the chance to comment on it, on our discoveries, we are then entitled to reach a verdict on who did what, when, and how. And how. Once we are sure of our facts in the most mundane sense, we are perfectly entitled to broadcast those conclusions. There is nothing necessarily weak or temporizing about impartiality. It is, however, a safeguard of truth and an assurance to the reader that we have done our work. Now, on the other hand, when you read Downey's article, and he interviews a lot of people in newsrooms across America, what you find is a lot of word salads in which they say that, well, this objectivity is in fact a white male obsession which distorts a true and full account. Well, it might be, of course, in which case it's failed the standards of impartiality, which I think is the key one. But nonetheless, that's how the crimes against journalism begin. Now, the second, of course, is groupthink and ignorance. that people are quite right when they worry about the fact that certain kinds of newsrooms have been too similar in the ideological beliefs and principles of the people in them. Most of cancel culture, in fact, is the result of people of entirely similar mind and opinion taking inevitably something like the same view on major issues. All the talk about diversity, of course, is, again, very limited. In Mr. Downey's argument, it never seems to include diversity of opinion. And that is perhaps because there hasn't been impartiality in newsrooms which have a very strong, and have had for many years, a very strong culture of left-wing dominance. Instead of truth, very often it is a narrative being sought, a narrative that expresses the general sympathies of the people in the room. Now, what does that mean for our purposes? Well, one of the things it means is that there will generally be, in modern Western newsrooms, a coverage of topics like religion, and in particular religion, which is being carried out by people who have very little interest in it and very little understanding of it. Now, I exclude, to some extent, the religion reporter. Generally speaking, they're good people who actually have to have sources in Christian and other religious communities. So they do approach the thing seriously. But of course, what is covered in the newsroom and the opinions brought to bear in it will generally be affected by the ignorance of a newsroom which is anti-religious in the main. The very good example of that is, in fact, from the Washington Post during Downey's time. A story on evangelical Christians included the information that they were poor, uneducated, and easy to lead. Now, if the guy had looked at the statistics, he would have found first that evangelical Christians tend to be among the richer middle-class people in America. Some are rich, of course, but the generality would be in securely middle class. That would not be true of all, of course. The second thing was they tend, statistics again suggest that they have a higher percentage of people who have not only degrees but advanced degrees, and that too is a significant factor. And as for being easy to lead, anyone who has any knowledge at all of religious communities like evangelical and Pentecostal Christians knows that they are continually splitting up and arguing because they tend to reject a change in doctrine or the performance of a new pastor. That's true not simply in the United States. The book by David Martin, who was both a religious sociologist in LSE and Southern Methodist, and as it happens also, a practicing locum for Anglican vicars who were not able, in order to allow them to get an occasional holiday. And his book the name has slipped my memory, I couldn't recall it when I was writing, but his account of the rise of Protestant sects in Latin America is an extremely valuable introduction to that truth. He thought that it brought about major social change, which I think is correct, of a progressive kind, and I will put it in my words, not his, because it turns bad Catholics into good Protestants. And there's something difficult for me to fully come to terms with. Now, I mentioned yes. I think religion in particular, there's a particular application of this ignorance which we should think about. The principle of neutrality in a different context. The modern liberal state often employs what it calls the principle of neutrality when treating differences and conflicts between religious explanations and claims and those of secular philosophy. Even in theory, there is a hidden bias in the state's reasoning because it treats a belief in a creator God as a matter of faith and belief in the universe as a result of as a result of accident. It treats that as a scientific conclusion. In fact, both explanations of the ultimate origin of life in all its complex beauty requires a final leap of faith. Christianity is explicit about this, so are other religions, but secularists arrive at their leap of faith by default. They treat the absence of conclusive proof for God as the conclusive proof of the universe as accident. As Richard Legutko points out in his book on liberal democracy, the application of the principle of neutrality to political clashes, especially on education and parental rights, and other rights in relation to religion, is all too often not neutral at all. It employs neutral language to obscure an anti-religious bias. And that too applies to most journalism, mainstream journalism in the West. And that is one of the, as the discussions have shown, and there is not agreement on this, that is one of the most important reasons to welcome the arrival of, the strength and development of the European conservative. Now, by the way, you must, I think I don't have all that much time, so I will skip something here, and you will tell me when I have to sort of wrap up. I mean, I had a passage demonstrating the results of this, and one of the examples is Russiagate, of course. I want to mention now something that when National Review was founded in 1955, it was regarded as the beginning of conservatism in America. It was a magazine in one respect very similar to the European Conservative, namely, although it was not formally a Catholic magazine, but a conservative one, it was almost uniformly, most of our staff were in fact Catholics, and of course our editor-in-chief was. I would just add that one rule we gave for that, we therefore agreed on, was our religious correspondent would never be a Catholic. And they weren't. They were very distinguished Protestant theologians and others. And then Richard Newhouse became our religion editor, and shortly after that converted to Catholicism. So we were frustrated. But there was only one such magazine. Now, of course, America was a very stable place. And I think magazines like yours and many others tend to erupt and to flower and to spread in conditions of great social crisis and conditions of intellectual debate. And now, if we look at the United States, we see there's National Review, there's the American Conservative, there's the New Criterion, there's First Things. There are any number of magazines in which, so to speak, the conservative idea has gradually decided to represent itself in one sphere after another. And this has been extremely productive for American society. I think it's evident that the same thing is happening in Europe as well. How many newspapers, how many small magazines are there at the moment, for example, in Hungary? Well, 116, around 75% of which deal with politics. How many websites? More than 3,000 in total, left and right both represented. Look at the past to see this happening. There were 104 cabarets and 40 political pamphlets before the First World War. The first political pamphlet in Hungary was established in 1848, the biggest and most influential in 1868, around the time of the Anschluss, when there was a huge debate. The debate then was between the two actors, Ferenc Deák and Kossuth. He was abroad, and they published their basic articles in Pesti Napló. Then there were no magazines or pamphlets published during the 3 months of the communist period. when there wasn't any diversity of opinion expressed, so to speak, except militarily. Repression is its own negation, however. And here is where I come to my final point. 1979, Stuart Hall published an article called The Great Moving Right Show. And he began, no one seriously concerned with the development of the left political strategies can afford to ignore the swing to the right taking place. We may not fully understand its extent, its specific character, its causes and effect. There's still some debate as to whether it is likely to be short-lived or long-term and so on. But the tendency is hard to deny. It would be wrong to identify the rise of this radical right solely with the success of the political party stakes of Mrs. Thatcher and the hard-edged cronies she's brought in to high office inside the Conservative Party. Mrs. Thatcher has given the swing to the right a powerful impetus and a distinctive personal stamp, but the deeper movement which finds its personification in her has, when properly analyzed, a longer trajectory. It has been well installed since the late 60s. It has developed through a number of different phases. First, the backlash against the revolutionary ferment of 1968. Then the bold populist bid by Mr. Powell, speaking over the heads of the party factions to the people, helping to construct the people in their most patriotic, racist, constitutional disguise. Then, borrowing the clothes of his opponent in the best Tory tradition, Mr. Heath, a politician instinctively of the soft centre, but not averse to going to the country with a program to restore Selsdon man, a close relative of Neanderthal man. Now, that last point is very key, because what had happened in the episode of Selsdon man is that Heath had embraced what became the principles of Thatcherism and the principles of the wider conservative movement that created the 80s, won the Cold War, and so on. But the betrayal of that program in 1974 by Mr. Heath led to a reaction against the leadership of the right and created a popular and a populist conservatism. It happened remarkably quickly, and it caused major changes. I am suggesting to you that this meeting here and the discussions we've just held are the reflection of a genuine movement of people with very similar and overlapping ideas, willing to debate the preeminence, willing to reconcile in order to win, but not willing to surrender all principle in doing so. I think I felt that. I was part of that movement, a very junior one. I was a leader writer on the Daily Telegraph. But we worked, we didn't know we'd win. That's key. We didn't know we'd win. But we did think it was worth fighting anyway. And consequently, that was in a way, the betrayal of the moderate leadership, the fact that the country was going to the dogs and no one was doing anything about it, the fact that attempts to explain its position candidly were denounced and boycotted, they were the things that created a firm conservative movement, which went on to win and to change the world. And the first sign of that was the pamphlets of the IEA, the creation of the Salisbury Review, the creation of the Salisbury Group, the installation of the Roger Scruton's group, in which he brought together the Conservative Philosophy Group, and finally, actually, I would say the fact that newspapers like the Times and the Telegraph came on board the more that the events developed. That they saw that they had lost readers, but more important, they'd lost the plot. They'd lost the thread of what was going on. And who told them? The fact their readers were demanding that they get writers and editors who had become famous through all the small pamphlets, the small magazines. The small magazines, in my view, are the neurons of democracy. And if we treasure them, if we help them, we push them forward, we will win, even if that's not our main objective.
Thank you so much, John. And apropos of that, as excited and happy as we are to be in Brussels, well, I should qualify that perhaps. What would delight me even more is to see many more publications appear and for us to serve as an inspiration to other people out there to produce their own content, their new publications online and in print. So thank you for coming. I believe there is a luncheon, a simple luncheon in the back somewhere in the hallway, perhaps. Oh, upstairs. Thank you all for coming. Please stay around and chat with us. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.